Hey there, welcome. Tonight we'll travel together through the mysterious town of Hawkins, Indiana, exploring 5 years of extraordinary events, supernatural forces, and the brave young people who face darkness itself. As you settle into your comfortable space, let the gentle flow of this timeline carry you into peaceful dreams. Every season holds its own mysteries, its own battles between light and shadow, its own heroes discovering strength they never knew they possessed. From a cold November night in 1983 to the spring of 1989, we'll witness how an ordinary Midwestern town became ground zero for interdimensional horror, government conspiracies, and the most important friendships that would define a generation. This is a story of children who played Dungeons and Dragons and fought real monsters, of a girl with a shaved head and extraordinary powers, of a mother who refused to believe her son was gone, of secrets buried beneath laboratory floors and creatures lurking in parallel dimensions, of courage found in the most unexpected places. So let's start with the beginning, with the small town of Hawkins in the fall of 1983, when everything changed forever. In the late fall of 1983, the small town of Hawkins, Indiana existed in peaceful ignorance of the forces lurking beneath its streets. Nestled in the Midwest with a population barely reaching 3,000, Hawkins embodied the Reagan-era American ideal. Tree-lined neighborhoods stretched across gentle hills. Main Street hosted family-owned businesses, a movie theater showing films weeks after their big city releases, and Melville's General Store, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The downtown square centered around a memorial to local sons lost in foreign wars, benches where elderly residents gathered to discuss weather and gossip in equal measure. The town's children attended Hawkins Elementary, Middle and High School, institutions that had educated their parents and would presumably educate their children. Basketball games drew crowds on Friday nights. The public library closed at 6. The police department, small but competent, dealt primarily with traffic violations and the occasional dispute between neighbours over property lines. Chief Jim Hopper, a man whose past troubles with loss and alcohol were whispered about but rarely mentioned directly, maintained order with minimal effort. Nothing exciting ever happened in Hawkins. This perception overlooked one significant anomaly. On the northern edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fencing and government warning signs, stood the Hawkins National Laboratory. Operated ostensibly by the Department of Energy, the sprawling complex of buildings and underground facilities bore little resemblance to the friendly bureaucracy its signs suggested. Guards patrolled the perimeter. Deliveries arrived in unmarked vehicles. Employees who lived in Hawkins spoke vaguely about their work when pressed, then changed subjects quickly. The lab had existed since the 1950s, its presence accepted as part of the town's identity, neither welcomed nor questioned too deeply. Most residents assumed the laboratory studied energy development or conducted environmental research. Some joked about secret weapons or spy technology, references to Cold War anxieties that felt almost quaint in 1983's optimistic atmosphere. The truth was considerably darker. Dr. Martin Brenner, the facility's director, oversaw experiments that pushed far beyond conventional science into realms of psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception, and dimensional physics. His test subjects were not volunteers but children, taken or manipulated into the program, their abilities cultivated through methods that ranged from rigorous to cruel. The families of Hawkins lived their ordinary lives unaware of what transpired in those underground rooms. Joyce Byers worked retail shifts at Melville's, raising her 2 sons alone after her husband abandoned them for another woman and a fresh start elsewhere. Will, her younger son, was quiet and artistic, often bullied but protected by loyal friends. Jonathan, the older boy, carried cameras everywhere, documenting the world through a lens that kept him separate from it. Karen Wheeler maintained her picture-perfect home, her daughter Nancy excelling in school, while her son Mike spent hours in the basement with friends, playing elaborate fantasy games. Ted Wheeler read his newspaper and ate his chicken, content in oblivious domesticity. The children themselves navigated the complexities of adolescence in 1983. Mike Wheeler, Lucas Sinclair, Dustin Henderson, and Will Byers formed an inseparable unit, bonded by Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, comic books, and shared outsider status. They communicated through walkie-talkies, built blanket forts, and believed in possibilities beyond their small-town existence. Nancy Wheeler and her best friend Barbara Holland attended parties where teenagers experimented cautiously with beer and romance. Steve Harrington represented everything popular and confident, unaware that his carefully constructed image would soon matter very little. The woods surrounding Hawkins stretched dark and deep, their paths familiar to children who used them as shortcuts and hideouts. The quarry on the outskirts drew swimmers in summer despite danger signs. Cornfields extended toward horizons, their neat rows hiding nothing more threatening than wandering pets. The town existed in what felt like perpetual autumn, leaves falling, air crisp, Halloween decorations appearing on porches and in windows. Beneath this, normally, literally beneath the streets and fields and woods, the Hawkins Laboratory maintained its secrets. Dr. Brenner's experiments had achieved results beyond his government sponsor's expectations. Test subjects demonstrated abilities that defied conventional understanding. And recently, their most promising subject, a girl designated simply as 11, had been pushed toward a breakthrough that would tear holes in reality itself. The town hummed with ordinary concerns, homework deadlines and family dinners, basketball games, and late-night phone calls. No one suspected that beneath their feet, experiments pushed the boundaries of the dimensional physics. No one imagined that their peaceful existence balanced on the edge of catastrophe. The night of November 6, 1983, would shatter this balance forever. Within Hawkins National Laboratory, the evening shift proceeded according to routine until it didn't. A scientist in a white coat ran through sterile corridors, his footsteps echoing against concrete walls, his breathing ragged with terror. Something pursued him, something that shouldn't exist outside theoretical mathematics and fevered nightmares. The fluorescent lights flickered as he reached the elevator, fingers stabbing desperately at buttons. The doors began to close, offering momentary hope. Then the creature arrived, all teeth and hunger, and the scientist's screams ended abruptly. Blood spattered across pristine walls. The elevator stood empty, its occupant gone, taken to somewhere the Department of Energy would never acknowledge. Elsewhere in the facility, a young girl with a shaved head and hospital gown moved through shadows with practiced silence. Subject 11 had no last name, no family beyond the clinical relationships of her captors, no memories before the laboratory's sterile rooms. But she possessed something far more valuable than conventional identity. Her mind could move objects, see across distances, enter thoughts not her own. Dr. Brenner called her his greatest success. She called him Papa, though the word carried no warmth, only complicated necessity. Tonight, chaos created opportunity. The creature's escape had triggered lockdown protocols, alarms blaring, staff scrambling to contain something they barely understood. 11 slipped through doors left momentarily unguarded, past checkpoints, abandoned in crisis. She had opened the doorway that released the creature, though not intentionally, not understanding what her powers would unleash when pushed beyond carefully calibrated limits. Guilt and self-preservation warred within her, but survival won. The November rain welcomed her into darkness as she fled into woods she'd only glimpsed through laboratory windows. The same rain fell on Mike Wheeler's basement, where 4 boys sat around a table covered with graph paper, dice, and painted miniature figures. Their Dungeons & Dragons campaign had lasted 10 hours, an epic quest reaching its climactic battle. Will Byers, playing a wizard, faced the Demogorgon, a monster whose name would soon carry terrible significance beyond their game. Mike Wheeler, the group's dungeon master, narrated the encounter with dramatic flair. Lucas Sinclair and Dustin Henderson shouted advice and warnings. Dice rolled. The Demogorgon won. Will's character fell. The game ended near midnight, later than intended, certainly later than their parents would approve. The boys gathered their belongings reluctantly, already planning the next session. Will loaded his backpack, pulled on his jacket, and headed for his bicycle. The ride home would take 15 minutes through empty streets and dark woods, a journey he'd made countless times. Mike's mother called down the basement stairs, reminding them of the hour. The boys exchanged goodbyes, promises to meet tomorrow, casual words that would later feel precious. Will pedaled into the November night, his bicycle light cutting weak illumination through fog and rain. The streets of Hawkins stood empty, houses darkened except for occasional porch lights. He followed familiar routes, turned onto Mirkwood, the wooded road the boys had named after Tolkien's dangerous forest. Trees pressed close on both sides. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. Everything felt normal, comfortably routine, until it didn't. The bicycle light flickered. Will looked up from the road and saw something standing ahead, something that shouldn't exist outside the fantasy game he'd just left. The creature was tall and wrong, its face opening like a terrible flower, revealing circles of teeth. Will's mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. This wasn't possible. This was Hawkins, Indiana, where nothing happened, where monsters were dice rolls and imagination. The Demogorgon moved toward him. Will's survival instincts overrode his paralysis. He yanked the handlebars, turned sharply, pedaled desperately toward home. The creature followed through the woods, faster than seemed possible, its movements predatory and certain. Will's house appeared ahead, the shed in the yard, sanctuary close enough to touch. He abandoned his bicycle mid-yard, ran to the shed, slammed the door. His hands found the rifle his mother kept there, loaded it with shaking fingers. The creature tore through the wall as if wooden nails were paper. Will raised the weapon. The lights went crazy, strobing and sparking. Then silence. Then nothing. Then a vanishing. By morning, Will Byers existed only as an absence. His bicycle lay abandoned in the road near his house, evidence of interrupted journey. His mother Joyce arrived home from closing shift at Melvold's to find her younger son missing, his bed empty, his brother Jonathan confused and worried. She called the police immediately, her voice already edged with the panic that would consume her completely in coming days. Chief Hopper responded with professional reassurance that felt hollow even as he delivered it. Kids didn't just disappear in Hawkins, there would be a simple explanation. He'd probably spent the night at a friend's house without permission, but the bicycle troubled Hopper. Children treasured their bikes, particularly boys in this town, where bicycles meant freedom and independence. Will wouldn't abandon it voluntarily. The location suggested something interrupted his ride home, something sudden enough to make him flee without his most prized possession. Hopper organized a search, deputies combing the woods, volunteers checking everywhere a frightened boy might hide or have hidden himself. They found nothing. No body, no blood. No signs of struggle beyond the abandoned bicycle and disturbed ground near the Byers' shed. At Hawkins Middle School, 3 boys learned their friend was missing. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin absorbed the news with growing horror. They'd seen Will hours ago, safe and laughing, making plans for tomorrow. How could he simply vanish? The teachers offered platitudes about Will probably being fine, just some miscommunication, but the boys knew better. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. Joyce Byers refused every attempt at comfort. She knew her son. Will wouldn't run away. Will wouldn't hide without telling her. Something had taken him. Something had hurt him. And every adult dismissing her fears made her more determined to find the truth. She called Will's father, her ex-husband Lonnie, who offered unhelpful skepticism. She called friends, neighbours, anyone who might have seen something. And as daylight failed again, she began to hear her son's voice, faint and desperate, calling to her through the walls of their house. The search continued. The town mobilized, shocked into community action. And in the woods, shivering and soaked, a girl with a shaved head and hospital gown hid from men with flashlights and dogs. Unaware that her escape and Will Byers' disappearance were connected by forces beyond either of their understanding. Chief Hopper's investigation began with routine procedures that quickly revealed unsettling inconsistencies. The state police wanted to classify Will's disappearance as a runaway case, but Hopper's instincts disagreed. Runaways packed bags, took money, left some trace of intention. Will Byers had vanished mid-journey home. His bicycle, the only evidence something had gone wrong. Hopper visited the Byers house, walked the route Will would have taken, examined the shed, where Joyce insisted something terrible had happened. Scorch marks on the walls, a lingering smell like ozone after lightning. The rifle Joyce kept there discharged, but with no bullet found. The investigation expanded to Hawkins' laboratory when Hopper discovered the facility's security had been compromised the same night Will disappeared. His official inquiries met bureaucratic walls. Dr. Brenner's staff showed him edited security footage, answered questions with careful vagueness, implied that classified energy research couldn't be discussed with local law enforcement. Hopper left frustrated but increasingly certain the laboratory hid something connected to Will's vanishing. His research into the facility's history revealed disturbing patterns. A woman named Terry Ives had claimed years earlier that Brenner stole her daughter, that the laboratory conducted experiments on children. Her lawsuit had been dismissed, her credibility destroyed, her mind apparently broken by the ordeal. While adults pursued official channels, the boys conducted their own search. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin rode their bicycles through the woods surrounding Hawkins, calling Will's name, checking hiding spots only they would know. Rain soaked them as they refused to abandon hope. On their second night of searching, they encountered her. A girl emerged from the darkness near where Will had vanished, thin and terrified, wearing only a hospital gown despite the November cold. Her head was shaved, her arm bore a tattoo, simple numbers, 011. The girl said almost nothing, her vocabulary limited, her fear of adults absolute. When the boys tried to take her to their parents or the police, she reacted with panic that suggested abuse, far worse than simple neglect. Mike, recognizing something in her eyes that reminded him of cornered animals, made a decision. He hid her in his basement, brought her food and blankets, promised she'd be safe. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. But the girl knew something about Will. When shown his photograph, she recognized him, pointed to images that suggested he was alive, somewhere the boys couldn't reach. They called her Elle, shortened from the numbers on her arm. She demonstrated abilities that defied rational explanation. Objects moved when she concentrated. She crushed a can with her mind. Blood dripped from her nose after exertion. A pattern they would learn signified mental strain. The boys, raised on science fiction and fantasy, accepted her powers more readily than adults might have. They'd spent years imagining impossible things. Now the impossible sat in Mike's basement, eating Eggo waffles and learning about friendship. Joyce Byers, meanwhile, descended into what others mistook for breakdown, but was actually breakthrough. The lights in her house behaved strangely, flickering in patterns that felt communicative rather than random. She heard Will's voice calling to her, muffled as if through water or great distance. Most people would dismiss such experiences as grief-induced hallucination. Joyce refused to dismiss anything. She bought Christmas lights, strung them across her living room wall, painted letters beneath each bulb, and when she called out to Will, the lights responded. The communication was crude but undeniable. Letters lit in sequence, spelling words. Will told her he was alive, he was scared, he was somewhere cold and dark. He told her to run when something approached, something dangerous. Joyce documented everything, tried to explain to Hopper and others what was happening, met skepticism that hardened her determination. If no one would believe her, she'd find Will herself. She'd follow his voice wherever it led, even into impossibility. The discovery at the quarry should have ended the search. State police pulled a body from the water, a boy matching Will's description and clothing. The coroner confirmed identity. The town mourned. A funeral was planned. But Joyce rejected what everyone else accepted. That wasn't her son. She knew Will lived because he told her so through the lights, because a mother knew things that transcended rational explanation. Hopper, watching Joyce's absolute certainty, began to doubt the official narrative himself. His investigation of the quarry body revealed troubling details. The morgue showed him what appeared to be Will Byers, but Hopper's experience investigating deaths told him something was wrong. He returned after hours, broke into the morgue, examined the body more carefully. It wasn't real. The corpse was synthetic, a construction sophisticated enough to fool casual examination, but falling apart under scrutiny. Someone had created a fake body and planted it to end the search. Only an organization with substantial resources and scientific capability could manage such deception. Hawkins' laboratory became Hopper's obsession. He broke into the facility, navigated its underground levels, discovered rooms that spoke of experiments beyond energy research. Before he could find real answers, security caught him, drugged him, deposited him back home with warnings to stop investigating. But the message failed to deter him. Instead, it confirmed his suspicions. The laboratory was hiding something about Will's disappearance. The fake body meant Will might actually be alive, trapped somewhere connected to Brenner's work. Nancy Wheeler's investigation proceeded along different lines, but reached similar conclusions. Her best friend Barb had vanished the same night as Will Byers, disappearing from Steve Harrington's pool party without trace or explanation. While Nancy had been inside losing her virginity to Steve, Barb had waited alone by the pool, loyal friend abandoned for popular boy. Now Barb was gone, and Nancy carried crushing guilt alongside desperate need to find her. Working with Jonathan Byers, who shared her determination to find missing friends, Nancy followed evidence into the woods where Will had vanished. They discovered something impossible. A wounded deer they'd been tracking disappeared into a tree trunk, pulled through by unseen force. Nancy approached the tree, found a split in its bark that opened into darkness beyond darkness, a passage into somewhere else. She crawled through. The place Nancy entered defied comprehension. It was Hawkins, but wrong. The same streets and houses existed, but decayed, covered in organic growth that pulsed like living tissue. The air tasted of rot and electricity. No sunlight penetrated the perpetual gloom. She found the deer, dead and partially consumed. Then she found something feeding on it, a creature that turned toward her with a face that opened into teeth. Nancy screamed. Jonathan heard her scream from the real world, pulled her back through the tree before the creature could reach her. They had discovered the Upside Down, though they didn't yet have a name for it. A parallel dimension existing alongside Hawkins, separated by membranes, thin enough to tear. A place where Will Byers somehow survived, hiding from the creature that hunted him. The boy's science teacher, Mr. Clark, would later explain the theory. Imagine a tightrope walker crossing between platforms. That's our dimension. But what if beneath the tightrope existed an infinite void? What if a flea lived on the tightrope, walking in only 2 dimensions? The flea wouldn't know about the acrobat above, or the void below. Now imagine the flea somehow created a doorway, a tear through the tightrope into that void. The Upside Down was that void, and someone at Hawkins' laboratory had created the doorway. Understanding 11 required understanding her origin, a story that began years before her escape into November rain. Terry Ives, a young college student in the early 1970s, had volunteered for what she believed were harmless government experiments, testing enhanced perception and cognitive abilities. The program, operating under the umbrella of MK Ultra, the CIA's real and notorious venture into mind control research, paid modest stipends to participants willing to undergo testing. Terry needed the money. The experiment seemed benign enough. Sessions in controlled environments, exposure to sensory stimulation, psychological evaluations. What Terry didn't know was that she was pregnant during the latter experiments. What she couldn't have known was that Dr. Martin Brenner saw her pregnancy not as complication, but as opportunity. The drugs administered to Terry, the techniques applied to enhance her latent psychic potential, affected the developing child within her. When Jane was born, in 1971, she demonstrated abilities that exceeded Brenner's theoretical models. The infant could move objects with her mind, could sense thoughts and emotions beyond normal infant awareness. Brenner recognized immediately what he'd accidentally created through Terry's unwitting participation. He took the child. The official story claimed Jane died shortly after birth. complications from her mother's drug use during pregnancy. Terry received fabricated medical records, a death certificate, sympathetic counseling about her loss. She should have accepted this narrative, grieved, and moved forward with her life. Instead, something in her knew the truth. Her daughter lived. The government had stolen her baby. Terry fought through legal channels, hired lawyers, filed lawsuits against the Department of Energy and Hawkins Laboratory, specifically. Her case was dismissed, her evidence deemed insufficient, her mental state questioned publicly until her credibility collapsed entirely. The final attempt to retrieve her daughter left Terry Ives trapped in a mental loop, her mind broken by either grief or by something Brenner's people did to silence her permanently. She remained physically alive, but psychologically absent, endlessly reliving the moment soldiers tore her baby from her arms. Her sister cared for her in a house where the television played continuously, white noise background to Terry's internal nightmare. Jane, renamed 11 for her designation as test subject number 11 in Brenner's expanded program, grew up knowing only the laboratory's sterile rooms and rigid routines. She slept in a cell with a bed and a single stuffed animal. She ate bland food at scheduled times. She underwent testing daily, sometimes hourly, her abilities pushed and measured and catalogued. Doctor. Brenner served as the only parent figure she knew. Papa, who praised her when she performed well and punished her when she failed or refused. The punishment never involved physical violence, nothing so crude. Instead, Brenner used isolation, withdrew affection, locked her in dark rooms until compliance returned. The laboratory housed other children during various periods, test subjects designated by numbers. Some demonstrated minor abilities, talents barely above statistical noise. Others showed genuine potential that Brenner cultivated with the same ruthless methodology applied to 11. But 11 remained his greatest success, the child whose powers exceeded all others, whose potential seemed limitless given proper motivation. The sensory deprivation tank became 11's primary training tool, a steel chamber filled with salt water maintained at body temperature. The tank eliminated all external stimuli, sight and sound and touch reduced to nothing. Floating in darkness and silence, 11's mind extended beyond her physical body's limitations. She could see across distances, enter other people's thoughts, observe targets that Brenner's government sponsors wanted monitored, Soviet officials, enemy agents, American citizens suspected of disloyalty. 11 served as psychic spy, too young to understand the implications of what she observed, too controlled to question her assignments. Brenner pushed her abilities constantly toward greater achievements. Remote viewing satisfied his sponsors, but didn't fulfill his theoretical understanding of what 11 might accomplish. He theorized that sufficient power and focus could breach dimensional barriers, could touch realms existing parallel to observable reality. He designed experiments to test this hypothesis, pushing 11 towards psychic contact with entities that might exist beyond conventional perception. The final experiment succeeded beyond Brenner's intentions and control. Placed in the sensory deprivation tank, instructed to make contact with an entity she'd observed in previous sessions, 11 reached out psychically and touched something vast and hungry. The creature she encountered existed in another dimension, a predator isolated from prey for unknown years. Her mental contact with it created a bridge, a tear in the fabric separating dimensions. The Demogorgon came through. The gate opened in the laboratory's basement, a wound in reality that bled darkness and cold. The creature escaped into Hawkins, driven by hunger and hunting instinct. 11 experienced the horror of what she'd unleashed, the terror of the creature loose in the facility, the deaths it caused, including the scientist in the elevator. Brenner, rather than showing concern for his staff's safety or 11's obvious distress, displayed only fascination with the successfully opened gate. He'd proven his theory. Dimensional barriers could be breached through psychic force. The relationship between 11 and Brenner was complex beyond simple victim and victimizer. Though those elements certainly existed, he'd raised her, taught her, given her the only structure and purpose she'd ever known. He'd also imprisoned her, used her, denied her every normal childhood experience. She called him Papa because he'd trained her to, because the word earned small kindnesses and avoided punishments. But she also feared him, resented him, and ultimately fled from him when opportunity arose. The girl who escaped into November carried extraordinary power born from cruel experimentation. Her abilities could move objects, enter minds, and tear holes between dimensions. She'd opened the gate that released the Demogorgon into Hawkins, though she'd done so unknowingly, manipulated by Brenner toward his theoretical goals. She carried responsibility without guilt, power without understanding, and she would need both to survive in a world that feared what she represented. The dimension 11 had accidentally opened defied every law of physics that governed observable reality. The Upside Down, as the children would name it, existed as a dark mirror of Hawkins, Indiana. Every street, every building, every tree occupied the same spatial coordinates as their real-world counterparts, but transformed into nightmare versions of themselves. The sky hung perpetually dark, neither day nor night, but something in between, a twilight that never shifted. The air tasted wrong, metallic and organic simultaneously, carrying particles that floated like snow but felt alive when touched. Temperature in the Upside Down remained consistently cold, the chill of deep caves or winter nights, but without wind or weather to explain it. Buildings stood in various states of decay, walls covered in creeping vines that pulsed with something resembling circulation. The organic matter coating surfaces appeared both plant-like and animal, membranous tendrils that responded to movement and touch. Spores drifted constantly through the atmosphere, their purpose unknown, but their presence oppressive. Everything felt damp despite the absence of rain, as if the dimension itself exhaled moisture. The Upside Down wasn't simply an alternate version of Hawkins. It was Hawkins frozen at a specific moment, captured like a photograph, but three-dimensional and traversable. November 6, 1983 became its permanent state. The day the gate opened, the instant 11's psychic contact with the Demogorgon tore the barrier between worlds. Nothing changed in this shadow realm because time functioned differently there, if it functioned at all. A calendar hanging in the upside-down version of a house would forever display that November date. A clock would read the hour when the dimension crystallized. This temporal freezing meant the Upside Down contained no people, no animals beyond those that entered through gates or tiers in reality. The dimension existed empty, except for its inhabitants. The creatures that had lived there before 11 opened the doorway, or that came through afterward. The Demogorgon served as apex predator, but other entities moved through the darkness. Smaller creatures, variations on the larger hunter, existed in unknown numbers. The source of these beings remained mysterious. Had they evolved within the Upside Down? Did they originate elsewhere and migrate to this shadow realm? The answers stayed beyond immediate discovery. Will Byers survived in this hostile environment through intelligence and desperation. When the Demogorgon pulled him into the Upside Down, he found himself in a version of his own neighborhood, rendered nightmarish but navigable. He recognized landmarks despite their corruption. His house stood where it should be, but empty, covered in those pulsing vines. The air inside thick with spores. He ran to the shed, his refuge in the real world, found it similarly transformed. Castle Byers, the fort Will had built in the woods behind his house, became his primary hiding place. The structure existed in the Upside Down because it had existed in reality when the gate opened. Will knew every corner of his creation, could hide within its walls when the Demogorgon hunted nearby. He moved carefully through his shadow town, scavenging supplies that existed in mirrored form, avoiding the creature when possible, fleeing when necessary. His survival instincts, honed by years of bullying and difficulty, served him better than adult sophistication might have. Communication with his mother provided Will's lifeline to hope. The barrier between dimensions was permeable in ways beyond physical passage. Sound could travel between worlds under certain conditions. Electronic devices, particularly lights and radios, could be manipulated from the Upside Down, with sufficient focus and need. Will called to his mother through the walls of her house, his voice barely reaching her but carrying enough to prove he lived. He used Christmas lights to spell messages, learned to control their illumination through concentration that drew energy he could barely spare. The Demogorgon hunted Will with patient determination. The creature tracked through multiple senses, drawn to blood and to the electromagnetic anomalies that marked dimensional boundaries. It moved between the Upside Down and Hawkins freely, once the gate existed, hunting in both realms, feeding on whatever it caught. Barb Holland died quickly after the creature pulled her through a small tear near Steve's pool, her body left to decay in the shadow dimension. Others vanished into the Upside Down, brief victims of an apex predator operating across dimensional barriers. Nancy and Jonathan's accidental discovery of the Upside Down came through a temporary portal, a tear small enough to close behind Nancy once Jonathan pulled her back. Their encounter provided crucial evidence that Will might survive in that dark realm, that the dimension existed as traversable space rather than abstract concept. Jonathan photographed what Nancy described, documented the organic growths and impossible architecture. Together, they began to understand that Will's disappearance wasn't kidnapping or death but displacement into a parallel reality. Mr. Rice and Mr. Clark, the boys' science teacher, provided theoretical framework for what seemed impossible. His explanation of dimensions and gateways, delivered to middle school students calling with urgent questions, translated advanced physics into accessible metaphor. The acrobat and the flea, platforms and voids, tightropes and tears in space. His patient teaching gave the children language for their discoveries, helped them understand that alternate dimensions represented legitimate scientific theory, that quantum mechanics allowed for possibilities beyond observable reality. Joyce and Hopper's eventual journey into the Upside Down required accepting impossibilities as fact. Hopper, a man who dealt in evidence and procedure, had to set aside rational skepticism to follow Joyce into her certainty. They entered the Upside Down through the gate in Hawkins' laboratory's basement, descending into the facility armed with Hopper's government contacts and Joyce's maternal determination. The gate appeared as a vertical wound in the wall, edges raw and pulsing, opening into darkness that light couldn't fully penetrate. Inside the Upside Down, they wore hazmat suits against the toxic atmosphere, communicated through radio headsets, carried flashlights that seemed to push back darkness without fully illuminating it. They followed Joyce's instinct toward Castle Byers, toward where she knew Will would hide if he could, and they found him, barely conscious, a tendril from the Upside Down's organic network forced down his throat, slowly consuming him from within. They pulled the tendril free, carried Will back through the gate, emerged into the real world, with a boy hovering between dimensions, infected by a place that didn't want to release what it had claimed. The Upside Down represented more than geographical space existing parallel to Hawkins. It was a realm where different rules applied, where biology and physics operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding. It was cold and hungry and patient, and the gate that connected it to Hawkins remained open, a wound that would need closing before the infection spread beyond control. Rescuing Will required accepting that the impossible had become necessary. The plan emerged from unlikely collaboration between children, desperate adults, and a girl with powers that defied conventional understanding. 11 could locate Will psychically, could enter the Upside Down mentally even without physical presence there. But her abilities needed enhancement through sensory deprivation, the same technique Brenner had used at the laboratory. Creating such equipment in a middle school gymnasium with limited resources tested ingenuity and determination equally. The makeshift tank consisted of a kiddie pool, hundreds of pounds of de-icing salt, and water heated to body temperature. The salt's concentration allowed flotation, the darkness eliminated visual stimuli, the silence created conditions where Eleven's mind could extend beyond physical limitations. She sank into the improvised bath wearing swimming goggles, surrounded by adults and children who become her unlikely family. Mike held her hand until the water covered her. Then 11 was alone with her thoughts, her focus, and the vast darkness where Will Byers hid. She found him quickly, her consciousness travelling distances that had no physical meaning. Will huddled in Castle Byers, barely conscious, the tentacle from the Upside Down's organic network wrapped around him like a parasite. 11 communicated what she saw to those waiting by the pool. Will was alive. He was in his fort. He was singing, the same song his mother and brother knew, "Should I Stay or Should I Go" by The Clash, the melody providing comfort in nightmare. Joyce and Hopper could find him if they moved quickly, if they entered the Upside Down before the creature consumed what remained of the boy. While Joyce and Hopper prepared for their rescue mission into the laboratory's basement gate, Nancy and Jonathan pursued their own confrontation with the Demogorgon. They'd armed themselves with weapons both conventional and improvised. A hunting rifle, gasoline, bear traps, anything that might damage a creature that existed partially outside normal physical laws. They created a trap in the Byers' house, using blood to lure the Demogorgon, betting that it tracked wounded prey across dimensional boundaries. The plan was desperate, dangerous, and necessary. They couldn't defeat the creature, but they might slow it long enough for Will's rescue to succeed. The children, meanwhile, faced threats more human but equally dangerous. Dr. Brenner's agents had been searching for 11 since her escape, using resources and technology beyond local law enforcement capabilities. They tracked her to Hawkins Middle School, surrounded the building with armed men and vehicles, demanded her surrender. The boys refused to abandon their friend. They fled on bicycles, 11 using her powers to shield them, to overturn pursuing vehicles, to create barriers between hunted children and adult predators with government authorization. The chase culminated in violence that demonstrated 11's true capabilities and their cost. When agents blocked their escape route, when vans closed in from multiple directions, 11 stopped running. She stood between her friends and their pursuers, raised her hand, and flipped a government vehicle completely over. The van tumbled through air like a toy, crashed upside down, its occupants unconscious or worse. The display of power shocked everyone, including 11 herself, blood streaming from her nose, her body trembling from exertion. The boys stared at what their friend could do when truly threatened. They reached the school, barricaded themselves in the gymnasium, prepared for final stand against overwhelming force. Dr. Brenner's team surrounded the building methodically, cutting off exits, preparing to extract 11 regardless of collateral casualties. The children could hear agents breaching doors, footsteps echoing through hallways, the systematic approach of people confident in inevitable victory. Mike held 11's hand. Lucas and Dustin positioned themselves with makeshift weapons they knew were useless. They'd saved their friend, kept her safe for days, and now faced capture, or worse together. The Demogorgon arrived drawn by the same psychic signature that attracted Brenner's agents. The creature came through the wall, impossible anatomy defying architecture's resistance. Hunting instinct focused on 11, and the children clustered around her. But the creature recognized other threats present. Dr. Brenner's men, armed and aggressive, drew its attention. The gymnasium became battleground between government agents and interdimensional predator, bullets and teeth, tactical training versus evolutionary perfection. 11 faced the Demogorgon with power and fear in equal measure. This was the creature she'd encountered in Brenner's experiments, the entity she'd accidentally released into Hawkins. Her responsibility, her nightmare, her fight. She channeled everything she had, all the training and pain and desperate love for the friends behind her, into confronting the monster. Energy crackled between them, visible and terrible. Psychic force meeting biological hunger. The creature advanced. 11 pushed back. The gym's lights exploded, the walls cracked, and in the final moments before either victor or victim emerged, 11 and the Demogorgon vanished together into particles and darkness. When the light returned, when the silence settled, the Demogorgon was gone. 11 was gone. Dr. Brenner lay dying from injuries sustained in the creature's initial attack. The boys stood alone in a ruined gymnasium, their friends sacrificed to save them and their town. Mike called for Elle desperately, searching the space where she'd stood, finding nothing but scattered ash and the echo of power expended beyond recovery. Joyce and Hopper emerged from the upside down, carrying Will Byers between them. The boy unconscious but breathing, infected by his time in shadow, but alive. They rushed him to Hawkins Hospital, where doctors struggled to understand his condition, the tentacle removed from his throat, the spores in his lungs, the shock and hypothermia. He survived through medical care, his mother's devotion, and resilient youth. The official story blamed his disappearance on getting lost in the woods, suffering exposure, and trauma-induced amnesia. The truth stayed buried under government classification and community desire to move forward. Hopper negotiated his silence and cooperation through veiled threats and explicit deals with the Department of Energy representatives who arrived to contain the situation. Hawkins' laboratory would continue its work under new oversight. The gates would be monitored and secured. In exchange, Hopper received assurances about his community's safety and something more personal, coordinates to where 11 might be found if she'd survived her apparent disintegration. He began leaving food in the woods, egos and other supplies in a hidden box, hoping his strange friend had merely escaped rather than died. Christmas came to Hawkins with careful celebration. Will sat at dinner with his family, apparently recovered, participating in normal holiday rituals. He excused himself to wash his hands, coughed unexpectedly, and expelled a slug-like creature into the sink. The vision of the Upside Down flashed across his perception, the shadow realm visible for a moment before reality reasserted itself. He said nothing. He dried his hands. He returned to dinner, where his mother and brother smiled at his presence, grateful for his return, unaware that the Upside Down had left pieces of itself inside the boy they'd rescued. The gate 11 had opened remained in Hawkins' laboratory's basement, sealed behind new security measures, but not destroyed. The Upside Down waited on the other side, patient and hungry. And far from Hawkins, in a Russian facility monitoring American dimensional research, scientists observed data that suggested the Americans had achieved a breakthrough worth investigating, worth replicating, worth weaponizing for their own purposes. 1 year passed. October 1984 arrived with changing leaves and Halloween decorations, superficial markers of normalcy that masked deeper disturbances. Hawkins recovered from Will Byers' disappearance with the resilience small towns demonstrate, when confronted with inexplicable tragedy, choosing communal forgetting over uncomfortable questions. The laboratory continued its work behind chain-link fences, stores reopened downtown, children returned to school. Life proceeded as if nothing fundamental had shifted, though everyone involved knew better. Will's recovery proved incomplete despite medical pronouncements otherwise. He attended therapy sessions at Hawkins' laboratory under Dr. Sam Owens, Brenner's replacement, a man who projected affable competence while overseeing the same dangerous research his predecessor had championed. Owens dismissed Will's symptoms as post-traumatic stress, a reasonable diagnosis for a boy who'd spent days in an alternate dimension. The nightmares, the anxiety, the flashbacks to cold darkness, all fit expected patterns for severe trauma survivors. But Will's episodes exceeded psychological disturbance. He experienced moments when the world around him shifted, when Hawkins transformed into its upside-down reflection without warning or transition. These visions lasted seconds or minutes, leaving him disoriented and frightened. During one episode on the school playground, he saw the sky darken, saw a massive shadow looming over the town, a creature so large its body stretched beyond visible horizons. The vision ended as abruptly as it began. Will told his mother about the shadow, struggled to describe something beyond description, a presence vast and malevolent and patient. New students arrived at Hawkins Middle School that fall, siblings from California, carrying West Coast attitudes into Midwestern conformity. Max Mayfield earned immediate notice through her arcade performance, claiming the top score on Dig Dug under the username Mad Max, a feat that impressed Mike's group, despite their initial resistance to adding a girl to their exclusively male friendship. She rode a skateboard, displayed confidence that bordered on aggression, and refused to explain why her family had moved to Indiana from sunny California. Her stepbrother Billy Hargrove made more dramatic entrance. Older attractive in ways that threatened Steve Harrington's social position, Billy radiated danger that drew some students and repelled others. His charm masked cruelty, his smile concealed rage barely controlled. The relationship between Billy and Max carried undertones of abuse, his authority over her exercised through intimidation and threats. Max's skateboard represented freedom from his surveillance, her friendship with the boys an escape from his control. 11 existed in neither realm, neither the normal world of school and social hierarchies, nor the shadow dimension that had claimed her months earlier. She lived with Hopper in his cabin deep in the woods, hidden from government searches and curious neighbours alike. Hopper had found her wandering near where he'd left supplies, brought her home, and created a life for her that balanced protection with imprisonment. She couldn't attend school, couldn't be seen in public, couldn't exist officially in any capacity. The cabin became 11's entire world for months. She watched television constantly, learned about human interaction through soap operas and game shows, absorbed language and culture secondhand. Hopper taught her reading and basic mathematics, cooked meals she never quite learned to appreciate beyond Eggo waffles, enforced rules designed to keep her safe that felt like the laboratory's constraints, with slightly better intentions. She called him Hopper rather than Papa, a distinction that mattered to both of them. Their relationship grew genuine despite its strange foundations. Foster father and psychic daughter navigating domesticity neither had imagined, but 11 chafed under restrictions that kept her from Mike and her friends. Hopper's rules, sensible from adult protective perspective, felt cruel to a girl who'd known only imprisonment before experiencing brief freedom. She wanted to attend school, to see movies, to be normal in ways Hopper explained were impossible, given the government agencies still searching for her. Their arguments escalated through fall, Hopper's frustration meeting 11's growing resentment, the cabin too small for 2 people learning to be family. Will's visions increased in frequency and intensity as Halloween approached. The shadow he'd glimpsed grew more defined in subsequent episodes, revealing itself as something alive and conscious, a presence aware of Will's observation. During one particularly severe episode, Will found himself standing in the upside-down version of Hawkins, the shadow descending toward him, entering him like smoke into lungs. He woke screaming, Joyce and Jonathan trying to comfort him while he described the feeling of something vast trying to fit itself inside his small body. Doctor? Owen's increased monitoring, running tests that revealed nothing physical wrong with Will. Despite his insistence, something had changed. Brain scans showed normal activity. Blood work came back clean. The medical establishment had no framework for understanding dimensional contamination, no precedent for treating a boy who'd spent a week breathing spores and darkness. They prescribed therapy and observation, missing entirely that Will's episodes weren't memories of trauma, but ongoing connections to a realm that refused to release him. The boys struggled to maintain their friendship group's cohesion under pressure from growth and change. Mike pined for 11, his grief manifesting as withdrawal from activities that used to bring joy. Lucas found himself attracted to Max, despite group resistance to including her. Dustin returned from summer science camp, claiming he had a girlfriend, Susie, though none of his friends believed someone that perfect could exist. Will wanted only to preserve their childhood, to play Dungeons and Dragons and ride bikes, resisting the adolescent transitions his friends embraced. The shadow that haunted Will's visions was patient. It watched Hawkins through the boy's eyes, learned the town's layout through his memories, prepared strategies for invasion that would use Will himself as gateway and spy. The Mind Flayer, as the boys would name it using Dungeons and Dragons terminology, possessed intelligence far exceeding the Demogorgon's predatory simplicity. It planned, it schemed, it waited for the perfect moment to strike. Beneath the fields surrounding Hawkins, a vast network of tunnels spread like veins through soil and bedrock, connecting the town to the Upside Down's influence in ways no surface observer could detect. The first signs appeared as agricultural anomaly rather than supernatural threat. Pumpkin patches owned by local farmer Merrill rotted overnight, their orange flesh turning black and collapsing inward as if consumed from within. Hopper investigated the report expecting pesticide contamination or vandalism, finding instead decay that defied natural explanation. The affected area extended in lines rather than circles, suggesting underground contamination spreading along specific routes. Hopper walked the patterns, noticed how the rot followed paths that connected disparate locations across the farmland. He brought soil samples to the laboratory, demanded Dr. Owens explain what could cause such targeted destruction. The tests revealed unusual chemical composition, organic compounds that shouldn't exist in Indiana topsoil, traces of the same substance coating everything in the upside down. Hopper's investigation led him into the tunnels themselves, a discovery made through following rot patterns to a particular field where the ground had collapsed partially, revealing darkness beneath. He descended with rope and flashlight, found himself in passages that stretched in multiple directions, walls covered in the same pulsing organic matter that characterized the upside down. The air tasted wrong. The temperature dropped significantly below surface levels, and the tunnels extended farther than his light could reach, a network that might span the entire town. Dustin Henderson's discovery began more innocuously, with what appeared to be an abandoned creature in his trash can. The small slug-like being seemed harmless, even endearing in its helplessness. Dustin, whose love for science and animals overcame common sense, adopted the creature, named it D'Artagnan, after the musketeer, and kept it hidden in his room. Dart, as the name shortened, ate anything offered, but showed particular preference for meat, consuming quantities that seemed impossible for something so small. The creature grew rapidly, disturbingly so, molting and expanding through stages that resembled accelerated evolution. Within days, Dart had tripled in size, developed legs, demonstrated hunting behaviours toward Dustin's cat Muse. The cat disappeared. Dustin found evidence suggesting Dart had consumed it, transformed from harmless pet into dangerous predator overnight. When Dart molted again, the face that emerged was unmistakable, despite miniature scale. The creature was a juvenile demogorgon, a demodog in the early stages of development toward the apex predator that had terrorized Hawkins the previous year. Dustin's panicked revelation to his friends created immediate crisis. A baby demogorgon loose in Hawkins meant the upside down was producing more creatures, meant the threat hadn't ended with the previous year's battle. Steve Harrington, who'd become unlikely ally to the children through his relationship with Nancy and subsequent friendship with them, helped Dustin track and contain Dart. Their search led to the tunnels, the same network Hopper had discovered, where Dart had fled seeking the environment his biology demanded. Steve and Dustin's partnership, odd pairing of popular teenager and science-obsessed middle schooler, developed through shared danger and genuine mutual respect. Steve demonstrated protective instincts toward the younger kids that surprised everyone, including himself, wielding his nail-studded baseball bat against threats he barely understood. Dustin provided scientific insight and strategic thinking that complemented Steve's physical courage. They became unlikely team navigating tunnels filled with creatures and spores. Will's connection to the Upside Down deepened catastrophically as the tunnel network expanded. The shadow he'd seen in visions wasn't observing passively anymore. It entered him during an episode, flooding into his consciousness like water into drowning lungs. The possession happened gradually at first, moments when Will's thoughts weren't entirely his own, gaps in memory where something else controlled his actions. Then the Mind Flayer took complete control, using Will's body as vessel and spy. The possessed Will moved through Hawkins gathering information, observing defensive preparations, reporting back to the intelligence controlling him through channels beyond normal perception. He attended sessions at the laboratory where doctors tested him, learned about security measures and response protocols. He visited the tunnels with Hopper and others investigating the network, watched them map vulnerabilities while appearing to help. The Mind Flayer used Will perfectly, a child trusted by everyone, suspected by no one, until patterns emerged that revealed the deception. Joyce recognized her son's possession through maternal instinct before evidence confirmed it. Will's mannerisms changed subtly. His word choices shifted. His reactions to familiar situations felt wrong. She tested him with questions only the real Will would answer correctly. Watched him struggle to access memories the mind flayer couldn't fully access through possession. The confirmation came when Will led a team directly into a tunnel ambush, his directions placing them exactly where demodogs waited, his warnings coming too late to prevent attack. The exorcism Joyce performed was desperate and brutal, a mother fighting for her son's soul through the only weapon available against cold-based entities. Heat. She took Will to Hopper's cabin, bound him to a chair despite his struggles, surrounded him with space heaters turned to maximum. The temperature in the small room climbed toward dangerous levels. Will screamed, pleaded, threatened, his voice shifting between child terror and ancient malevolence. Joyce held firm. Jonathan supported her, despite his horror at torturing his brother, and gradually the mind flayer released its grip. The black particles that emerged from Will's mouth and nose suggested the entity had been physical presence as well as psychic parasite. The substance dissipated in the heat, driven out by temperatures the Upside Down's biology couldn't tolerate. Will collapsed unconscious once freed, his body temperature dangerously elevated, but himself again. And in his final moments before the mind flayer lost control, Will had managed to communicate one crucial piece of intelligence: the tunnel's central hub, the location where burning would cause maximum damage to the network and the entity controlling it. Hundreds of miles from Hawkins, 11 pursued answers to questions about identity and belonging that Hopper's cabin couldn't address. Her departure from the woods came after another argument about restrictions, another day watching soap operas, while her friends faced danger she sensed but couldn't reach. She left a note, took supplies Hopper had gathered, and travelled to Chicago following coordinates discovered through psychic connection with her mother. Terry Ives remained trapped in the mental loop that had consumed her years earlier, her consciousness endlessly reliving the soldiers, tearing baby Jane from her arms. 11 sat beside her mother in the house where her aunt provided care, touched Terry's hand, and entered the broken woman's mind seeking understanding. What she found was traumatic memory played on endless repeat, the same moment of loss cycling forever. But within that loop existed fragments of other memories, pieces of Terry's investigation before her mind shattered. One memory showed another girl, another number tattooed on another arm. 8. A sister. The coordinates led 11 to an abandoned warehouse in Pittsburgh, where Carly Prasad lived with a gang of outcasts and criminals. Carly, designated Subject 8 in Brenner's program, had escaped years before 11, survived through abilities that created illusions powerful enough to fool multiple senses simultaneously. She could make people see things that didn't exist, hide things that did, manipulate perception so thoroughly that reality became optional. Her gang used these abilities for theft and vengeance against those who'd wronged them. Carly welcomed 11 with recognition and calculation in equal measure. They were sisters through Brenner's experiments, connected by shared trauma and similar powers. Carly offered belonging, purpose, and a philosophy dramatically different from what Hopper had taught. She believed in hunting those who'd hurt them, eliminating threats before threats could eliminate her. Her gang pursued former Hawkins lab employees, particularly those involved in the experiments that had stolen their childhoods. The warehouse became 11's temporary home, filled with people who'd survived through violence and looked after each other with fierce loyalty. They accepted 11 immediately as Carly's sister, taught her makeup and fashion, gave her a punk aesthetic that felt liberating after months of hiding. Carly trained 11 to channel anger rather than suppress it, to use rage as fuel for her abilities. Where Hopper had counselled control and caution, Carly encouraged unleashing everything without restraint. 11 participated in the gang's vengeance mission, hunting a former lab employee who'd assisted Brenner. The man had family, children who watched in terror as Carly created illusions of monsters, and 11 prepared to kill. In that moment, facing a frightened child who reminded her of herself, 11 recognized the difference between justice and cruelty. She refused to complete the execution, rejected Carly's philosophy of unlimited vengeance, chose mercy despite the man's complicity in their suffering. The decision created fracture between the sisters. Carly argued that showing mercy to their enemies guaranteed continued persecution, that only through eliminating all threats could they be truly free. 11 countered that becoming killers transformed them into what Brenner had tried to create, weapons without conscience. Their fundamental disagreement revealed different responses to shared trauma. Carly had built identity around anger and revenge. 11 was building something else. The psychic vision that called 11 home arrived while the gang debated their next target. She saw Mike in danger, saw Hopper threatened, felt Hawkins under assault from forces she recognized. The connection to her friends, to the people who'd accepted her without demanding she become weapon or tool, pulled stronger than connection to biological sister she'd just met. Carly pleaded with her to stay, argued that Hopper and the others would eventually betray her, as everyone betrayed people like them. 11 chose to leave anyway. The journey back to Hawkins took days by bus and hitchhiking. Time 11 spent contemplating the choice she'd made. Carly represented one possible future, surrounded by people who understood her uniqueness, but defined themselves entirely through trauma. Hopper and her friends represented another path, acceptance without complete understanding, belonging earned through shared experiences rather than shared victimization. The girl who had spent her life controlled by others made her own choice. Power mattered less than the people she loved. 11 returned to Hawkins with abilities strengthened by Kaylee's training, appearance transformed by the gang's aesthetics, but personality fundamentally unchanged. She remained the girl who ate Egos, who cared about Mike Wheeler, who wanted safety for her found family more than vengeance against her past. The lessons from Chicago would prove valuable in battles ahead, but not in the ways Kaylee had intended. Bob Newby entered the story as Joyce's boyfriend, a gentleman who managed the local Radio Shack and harboured genuine affection for a woman carrying trauma he couldn't fully comprehend. He'd known Joyce in high school, remembered her before hardship and disappointment shaped her into someone who expected catastrophe. His courtship was patient, his presence steady, his acceptance of her sons complete. Jonathan tolerated him. Will liked him genuinely. Joyce allowed herself cautious hope that normalcy might be possible. The drawings covering Will's bedroom walls appeared to Bob as artistic expression, abstract patterns in various colours spreading across paper after paper. Joyce saw something different, recognised the furious urgency in how Will had created them, the trance-like state during their production. She gathered the drawings, spread them across the living room floor, tried to discern meaning from what looked like chaos. Bob studied the collection with the puzzle-solving enthusiasm that made him excellent at his work, saw connections Joyce had missed. The patterns weren't random. Bob recognised topographical elements, intersections and pathways arranged with geographic logic. When he connected the drawings in proper sequence, they formed a map. Not an abstract representation, but a precise diagram of tunnels spreading beneath Hawkins, each line corresponding to underground passages, each junction marking where multiple tunnels converged. Will had drawn what he'd seen during possession, the Mind Flayer using his knowledge to create comprehensive chart of the network it controlled. Dr. Owens and his team studied Bob's revelation with alarm that confirmed Joyce's worst fears. The tunnel system extended beneath most of Hawkins, a network far more extensive than Hopper's initial explorations had revealed. The laboratory organised an expedition into the tunnels, armed teams entering the underground to map the network, assess the threat, and determine how to eliminate it. Will accompanied them despite Joyce's protests, his knowledge of the tunnel layout deemed essential. Bob stayed behind, watching Will's mother pace and worry. The expedition moved through tunnels coated in organic matter that pulsed like living tissue, breathing or circulating fluids through processes that defied biological classification. The air hung thick with spores. The temperature remained unnaturally cold. Hopper's team planted markers, took samples, advanced cautiously toward the central hub Will had indicated before the Mind Flayer's expulsion. Everything proceeded according to plan until Will's warning came too late. The Mind Flayer retained connection to Will despite exorcism, could influence him subtly, use residual links to monitor through his senses. The boy led them directly into trap, not through malice but through compromise he couldn't fully resist. His shouted warning about danger came moments before the tunnel walls erupted, vines whipping toward human intruders, the network defending itself against invasion. The team fled toward the exit, demodogs emerging from side passages, drawn by the Mind Flayer's command to eliminate the threat. The decision to burn the tunnels came from desperation and logic combined. Heat harmed creatures from the upside down consistently. Fire would damage the organic network extensively. The risk involved aggravating the Mind Flayer, provoking massive retaliation, but allowing the tunnels to spread unchecked guaranteed eventual catastrophe. Hopper's team used flamethrowers against the vines, watched organic matter shrivel and burn, created conflagration in the central hub designed to collapse the entire network. The Mind Flayer's response was immediate and overwhelming. Every demodog in the tunnel system turned toward Hawkins' laboratory, called by rage or pain or strategic calculation. The creatures moved in coordinated pack, their individual hunting instincts subsumed by collective intelligence directing them. They attacked the facility's perimeter, breached security measures designed for human threats, flooded into corridors where scientists and guards fought desperate rearguard actions against inhuman predators. The laboratory's lockdown protocols, designed to contain dimensional breaches or unauthorized intrusions, became liability when power failures trapped personnel in sealed sections. Bob's expertise with electronics and security systems made him invaluable in crisis. He volunteered to reach the basement, to reset circuit breakers and restore power, to enable evacuation before the demodogs killed everyone inside. Joyce protested. Bob insisted. Hopper provided cover, and Bob descended into the facility's depths with determination born from love for Joyce and her sons. The technical work took minutes, locating the right breakers, following procedures he'd memorized from Radio Shack manuals applied to more sophisticated systems. Bob's hands moved quickly, efficiently, his mind focused on the task rather than the sounds of combat echoing through the building, the power restored with a hum of returning electricity. Lights flickered on, doors unlocked. The trapped personnel, including Joyce and Will, could escape to the main entrance. Bob ran toward a reunion with people he'd saved, towards safety that seemed achievable as the hallway to the lobby came into view. Joyce and Will watched him approach, relief and joy mixing on their faces. Then the demodog came through the side corridor, drawn by movement or heat or simply hunting instinct. Bob fell before he could cry out, the creature's attack brutal and efficient. Joyce screamed. Will turned away. Hopper pulled them both toward the exits before more demodogs arrived. Bob Newby died in Hawkins' laboratory's hallways, his body left behind as survivors fled. The man who'd loved Joyce Byers, who'd treated her sons with kindness, who'd solved puzzles and reset breakers and saved lives, became another casualty of Hawkins' supernatural war. His death was heroic and pointless and tragic. The laboratory survivors reached vehicles outside, escaped while demodogs pursued them briefly before returning to the burning tunnels, and Joyce grieved the loss of someone good in a world that seemed to kill good people first. Coordination across multiple fronts became essential as the Mind Flayer's assault intensified. The creature had demonstrated strategic thinking beyond simple predation, using Will as spy, the tunnels as infrastructure, the demodogs as army. Defeating such distributed intelligence required simultaneous action against its various manifestations, overwhelming the Mind Flayer's ability to respond to threats across separated locations. The plan emerged from necessity and desperation, each group accepting dangerous roles in a coordinated strike designed to end the invasion permanently. Steve Harrington found himself leading a group of middle schoolers into combat against interdimensional monsters, a responsibility he'd never imagined during his days as Hawkins High's popular king. Dustin, Lucas and Max joined him at the junkyard, where they'd fortified an old bus as defensive position against approaching demodogs. The creatures circled the perimeter, drawn by the mind flayer's direction to eliminate the children who'd repeatedly disrupted its plans. Steve wielded his nail-studded bat with grim determination, positioned himself between the kids and the pack. The standoff ended unexpectedly when Dart, Dustin's former pet, now grown to full demodog size, recognized his original caretaker. The creature approached Dustin without attacking, responded to his voice, accepted the Three Musketeers candy bar offered as peace offering. While Dart consumed the chocolate, the other demodogs waited, their pack coordination momentarily disrupted by one member's independent behavior. Dustin talked to Dart about memories of protection and care, reminded the creature of safety it had known before transformation. The pack moved on, allowed the children to pass, drawn by stronger imperatives elsewhere. Mike Wheeler's reunion with 11 came as she returned from Chicago, appearing at the moment of greatest need, with powers enhanced and appearance transformed. Months of separation dissolved in an embrace that said everything words couldn't. She'd come back. She'd chosen them. Whatever battles lay ahead, they'd face together. Mike's relief and joy gave way quickly to focus on immediate crisis. 11 was here, which meant they could close the gate. She was the only one with sufficient power to seal the dimensional wound her abilities had opened. Joyce and Jonathan implemented their desperate plan to free Will from the Mind Flayer's residual control. They returned to Hopper's cabin, recreated the heat treatment that had worked before, pushed temperatures even higher this time. Will's screams filled the small space as they applied heaters directly to his body, monitored his vital signs while inflicting what resembled torture. Jonathan held his brother despite the heat, murmured apologies and encouragement. Joyce maintained the temperature, trusted maternal instinct over medical caution. The Mind Flayer fought for its connection to Will, used the boy's voice to beg them to stop, threatened consequences, tried manipulation and intimidation alternately. But the heat weakened its grip, drove the shadow substance from Will's body through methods that bypassed psychic defenses. In moments of clarity between the Mind Flayer's control attempts, Will communicated crucial intelligence. The creature feared fire not just for physical damage, but because heat disrupted its ability to coordinate. Close the gates while the tunnels burned, attack on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Mind Flayer couldn't defend everything at once. Hopper and 11 descended into Hawkins' laboratory together, their relationship having evolved from captor and captive to something approaching actual family. Hopper carried weapons. 11 needed none beyond her abilities. They navigated corridors damaged by the demodog attack, stepped over debris and evidence of recent carnage, descended to the basement level where the gate pulsed like an open wound. The dimensional breach had grown since 11 first tore it open, spreading across the wall in organic patterns that suggested the upside down actively pushing through. The gate radiated cold and wrongness, a rupture in reality that whispered promises of invasion. Tendrils of shadow reached through, testing, probing, seeking weakness to exploit. Hopper positioned himself to guard 11's back while she worked, fired at demodogs emerging from side passages drawn by the gate's distress signals. 11 approached the breach, raised her hands, channeled everything Carly had taught her about using anger, alongside everything Hopper had taught her about protecting what mattered. Closing the gate required power beyond anything 11 had demonstrated previously. She pulled from depths of ability she'd barely touched, drew on reserves of strength built through months of practice and fear and determination. The gate resisted, the upside down fighting to maintain its connection to Hawkins. 11's nose bled freely, her muscles trembled. The lights throughout the facility strobed wildly, and gradually, impossibly, the gate began to close. The Mind Flayer, sensing its avenue of invasion collapsing, made final desperate attempt to maintain its presence. The shadow substance still inside Will surged toward controlling him completely, tried to force him to run toward the gate before it sealed. But Joyce and Jonathan held him, maintained the heat that burned away the last traces of possession. Black particles streamed from Will's mouth and nose, dissipated in the cabin's scorching air. The boy collapsed, freed finally and completely from the entity that had controlled him. 11 screamed with effort as the gate shrank, the dimensional wound sealing against the Upside Down's resistance. The tendrils retreated, the cold diminished, the whispering stopped, and with a final surge of power that dropped 11 to her knees, exhausted and bleeding, the gate closed. The wall became solid again, scarred but whole. The doorway between dimensions had been sealed. Billy Hargrove's subplot intersected the main battle when he arrived at the buyer's house seeking Max, found her with Lucas and the others, flew into rage fueled by racism and control issues. The confrontation turned violent, Billy's physical advantage overwhelming, until Max grabbed a syringe of sedative prepared for Will, jabbed it into her stepbrother's neck. She stood over his unconscious body with Steve's bat, threatened worse if he ever touched her friends again. The power dynamic between them shifted irrevocably in that moment. December brought the snowball, Hawkins Middle School's winter dance, an evening of awkward dancing and self-conscious fashion that felt gloriously normal after weeks of supernatural combat. Dustin arrived confident in his new haircut, suffered rejection from girls who didn't appreciate his style, found comfort from Nancy Wheeler, who danced with him kindly. Lucas and Max swayed together. Will enjoyed an evening free from visions or possession, and Mike danced with 11, who wore a dress Nancy had helped her choose, who looked beautiful and happy and finally allowed to simply exist. Hopper's adoption of 11 became official through forged documents and Dr. Owens' assistant's government apology for previous persecution taking form of helping the girl acquire legal identity. She became Jane Hopper on paper, kept 11 in practice, gained the security of official belonging. Hopper promised to work on his overprotective tendencies. 11 promised to work on her rule-breaking. Both knew they'd struggle with those promises, but the effort mattered more than perfect compliance, yet peace remained incomplete. In the Upside Down, separated from Hawkins by the sealed gate, the Mind Flayer towered over the frozen landscape. It hadn't been destroyed, merely denied access. The ancient entity watched and waited, patient beyond human comprehension, already plotting alternative routes to the world it intended to consume. Summer arrived in Hawkins 8 months after the gate's closing, bringing heat and humidity that transformed the small town into something resembling normalcy. July 1985 marked a period of apparent peace. The Upside Down sealed away, the Mind Flayer contained in its shadow dimension. The children who defended their town now navigating the complexities of adolescence without immediate supernatural threats. The opening of Starcourt Mall represented progress, modernity arriving in a community that had previously defined itself through small-town traditionalism. The mall rose at Hawkins Edge, a sprawling complex of stores and restaurants, and entertainment that drew crowds from surrounding counties. Its gleaming corridors and neon signs promised everything the shopping experience should be, abundance and variety previously requiring trips to Indianapolis. The food court offered cuisines beyond Midwestern standards. The cinema showed first-run movies on multiple screens simultaneously. Families wandered through air-conditioned comfort. Teenagers claimed the arcade and ice cream parlors as territory, and downtown Hawkins withered accordingly. Main Street's family-owned businesses couldn't compete with the mall's selection and prices. Stores that had operated for generations faced declining foot traffic, revenue losses that threatened survival. The mayor's enthusiastic support for Starcourt's development made sense once his financial connections to the project surfaced, bribes and incentives that compromised his duty to existing merchants. The mall represented capitalism's inevitable march, creative destruction, eliminating old establishments to make room for new. Mike Wheeler and Eleven's relationship consumed both teenagers completely, to Hopper's increasing frustration and anxiety. His daughter, legally official now but still learning normal social behavior, spent every possible moment with Mike. They held hands, they kissed, They occupied Mike's basement for hours, engaging in activities Hopper preferred not to imagine too specifically. His attempt at having a heart-to-heart talk with Mike resulted in threats barely disguised as fatherly concern, warnings that terrorized the boy into avoiding Eleven temporarily. The forced separation hurt Eleven more than Hopper had anticipated. She'd built her identity around connection to Mike and the others, had learned about love and belonging through their acceptance. Being told she couldn't see Mike felt like the laboratory's restrictions reimposed. She and Hopper fought frequently, their relationship tested by his protective instincts and her growing independence. The cabin that had been sanctuary became prison again, though one she could leave if willing to defy the man she'd come to see as father. Lucas and Max navigated their own relationship dynamics, breakups and reconciliations following patterns of teenage drama amplified by Max's complicated home situation. Billy's presence loomed over Max's life constantly, his control and abuse creating stress she couldn't fully explain to Lucas. They fought about trust and honesty, broke up and reunited multiple times over the summer, their relationship serving as backdrop to larger events neither anticipated. Will Byers felt increasingly isolated from friends who'd moved beyond childhood interests he wanted to preserve. Dungeons and Dragons sessions that had once consumed entire days now competed with dating and jobs and social activities Will didn't share. His attempts to organize campaigns met resistance or cancellation. His frustration erupted after another ruined session, his anger about being left behind finding voice in accusations that his friends no longer cared about what had mattered to them. The outburst revealed deeper hurt. The boy who'd survived the upside down, now struggling to survive normal adolescence. Dustin Henderson returned from Camp Nowhere, boasting about Susie, his girlfriend, who allegedly existed, despite her convenient absence from Hawkins and lack of photographic evidence. His friend's skepticism was understandable. Dustin's description made Susie sound impossibly perfect, beautiful and intelligent and scientifically minded, a girl who'd chosen him despite his teeth and general awkwardness. The truth of her existence would be proven later through circumstances none of them could predict. Steve Harrington's post-high school life had not proceeded according to the plan he'd barely formulated. College rejections led to employment at Scoops Ahoy, the mall's ice cream parlor, where he wore a sailor costume that destroyed whatever cool remained from his popular kid days. His co-worker, Robin Buckley, a band geek who'd attended Hawkins High without ever intersecting his social circle, delighted in mocking his diminished status. Their relationship began with mutual disdain that would transform into something more meaningful. Robin brought intelligence and observational skills to complement Steve's protective instincts and unexpected emotional depth. She spoke multiple languages, absorbed information constantly, and maintained running commentary on the mall's customers with dry wit Steve found himself appreciating. Their shifts together passed quickly, despite the humiliation of the costume and the repetitive nature of ice cream service. Robin challenged Steve to think beyond his previous limitations, recognized qualities in him that popularity had hidden. Dustin's arrival at Scoops Ahoy with mysterious news disrupted Steve and Robin's comfortable antagonism. He'd built a radio tower on a hill near Hawkins, a project funded by his science camp earnings and motivated by desire to communicate with Susie. While testing the equipment, he'd intercepted a transmission in Russian, a coded message repeating at regular intervals. His translation attempts produced gibberish, but the mere existence of Russian communications in Indiana during the Cold War demanded investigation. The message, when eventually decoded through Robin's language abilities, referenced locations within Starcourt Mall specifically: Silvercat Feeds, China Passage, Carousel, Indiana Flyer. Each phrase corresponded to a store or attraction within the complex. The code suggested the mall harbored something beyond retail, a secret operation hidden beneath consumerism's cheerful facade. Steve and Dustin's investigation, initially dismissed by Robin as Cold War paranoia, would reveal a Soviet presence in Hawkins far more ambitious and dangerous than anyone imagined. Beneath the mall's foundation, accessible through service corridors and hidden elevators, Soviet scientists and soldiers had constructed a facility dedicated to accessing the upside down. They'd monitored America's dimensional research, learned of Hawkins Gate through intelligence channels, determined to replicate and weaponize what they understood as breakthrough in physics and military capability. The invasion wasn't military in conventional sense, but scientific, attempting to tear open their own gateway to a dimension they believed offered strategic advantage. The Mind Flayer's return began with rats, a detail so mundane that initial reports seemed like routine pest control rather than dimensional invasion. Mrs. Driscoll complained to the Hawkins Post about vermin consuming her fertilizer, behaviour inconsistent with normal rat biology, but easily dismissed as quirk of small-town life. Other reports followed, rats gathering in unusual numbers, moving with coordination that suggested collective purpose, drawn towards something observers couldn't identify. Nancy Wheeler, working at the Hawkins Post as summer intern, alongside Jonathan Byers, pursued the rat story despite her editor's dismissal. The newsroom's casual misogyny manifested in assignments given to Nancy, fluff pieces, and coffee runs, while male reporters covered real news. Her persistence in investigating what seemed like simple pest infestation annoyed her superiors, who saw her determination as inability to accept her place rather than journalistic instinct. Jonathan photographed the evidence Nancy collected, documented patterns that suggested the rats weren't just gathering, but transforming. The transformation was grotesque and inexplicable. Rats consumed chemicals, fertilizers, and each other in feeding frenzies that left survivors visibly changed. Their movements became more coordinated. Their behavior shifted from individual survival to collective action. Then they began exploding, their bodies detonating into organic matter that merged into larger masses. The process resembled biological assembly, individual components sacrificing themselves to build something greater. The Mind Flayer, trapped in the upside down by the sealed gate, had found alternative route to Hawkins. Small fragments of its substance had remained in the real world after the gate's closure, particles too dispersed to maintain consciousness, but capable of basic directives. These fragments infiltrated rats, used their biomass as foundation for rebuilding physical form in a dimension it could no longer access directly. The process was slow, inefficient, but possible, and the Mind Flayer was patient. Billy Hargrove's encounter with the Mind Flayer began as accident, wrong place at wrong time, a lifeguard closing the community pool after hours. He'd received complaints about strange activity at the abandoned Brimborn Steelworks, teenagers using the facility for parties, or worse. His investigation was cursory, motivated more by desire to escape his father's house than genuine concern about vandalism. The steel mill stood dark and empty, or so it appeared until he ventured deeper into its industrial caverns. The Mind Flayer's mass had grown substantial by the time Billy encountered it, a pile of organic matter composed of rats and chemicals, and the biomass from its consumption. The substance moved with liquid fluidity and muscular contraction simultaneously, defying categories of solid or fluid. Billy ran. The Mind Flayer pursued. The chase ended at the mill's exit, where the creature overtook him, surrounded him, forced itself into his body through every orifice. Possession differed from what Will had experienced. Where the Mind Flayer had controlled Will gradually, testing boundaries and building influence, it took Billy completely and immediately. His consciousness remained aware, trapped beneath the entity's control, screaming silently while his body moved according to alien directives. The Mind Flayer needed more biomass to rebuild its physical form. Billy would provide it, hunting other humans, bringing them to the steel mill for conversion into the growing mass. Heather Holloway became Billy's first victim, the lifeguard he worked with, a girl who trusted him enough to approach when he seemed distressed. He lured her to the steel mill with manufactured vulnerability, brought her before the Mind Flayer's mass, held her down while the creature consumed her. Heather's screams echoed through abandoned machinery. Then she rose, possessed like Billy, her consciousness imprisoned while the Mind Flayer directed her body toward recruiting more victims. The Flayed operated according to hive intelligence, each possessed individual, connected to the mind flayer's central consciousness, seeing through their eyes, directing their actions, building its army one person at a time. They maintained appearances, attended work and family obligations, behaved normally enough to avoid suspicion, while gradually assembling more recruits. Heather brought her parents Tom and Janet Holloway. Billy targeted others he encountered through lifeguarding and daily routines. The flayed population grew. Mrs. Driscoll's consumption of fertilizer and chemicals revealed itself as preparation for flaying, the mind flayer conditioning victims before full possession. Nancy and Jonathan's investigation led them to her house, where they found the elderly woman behaving erratically, eating substances that should have poisoned her. When Nancy tried to help, Mrs. Driscoll attacked with strength and coordination beyond her years, fought like something else controlled her body. The hospital where they took Mrs. Driscoll became site of further revelation. She spoke in fragments about returning to the source, about serving the shadow. Her behaviour shifted between lucid elderly woman and violent creature. Then she simply left, walked out of the hospital with purpose, drawn toward the steel mill like iron to magnet. Nancy and Jonathan followed, discovered her joining others at Brimborn, witnessed the horror of humans willingly dissolving into the biomass pile. Eleven's investigation of Billy proceeded through psychic observation, entering his memories to understand the changes her friends reported. She saw his encounter with the mind flayer, felt his terror and rage as possession occurred, witnessed his desperate attempts to resist control. She also saw his victims, the people he'd brought for conversion, the growing army assembling in secret. The discovery confirmed that the mind flayer had returned despite the gate's closure, had found new method of invasion that bypassed dimensional barriers. The sauna test emerged as strategy for confirming possession through the flayed's weakness to heat. Mike, Lucas, Max, Will, and 11 lured Billy to the pool, locked him in the sauna, raised the temperature to levels that should have driven out the mind flayer, as it had with Will. Billy fought the heat, the mind flayer using his body to smash through walls, attacking the children with murderous intent. 11 held him telekinetically, watched his face shift between Billy's consciousness and the entity controlling him. For moments between the mind flayer's absolute control, Billy surfaced. His real self glimpsed freedom, reached toward it, apologized through the possession. Then the entity reasserted dominance. Billy became weapon again, and only 11's power prevented him from killing them all. He escaped eventually, fled back to the steel mill, reported to the mind flayer about the children who discovered its presence. The element of surprise was lost. Open war was inevitable. Robin's facility with languages transformed cryptic Russian phrases into actionable intelligence. The transmission referenced specific mall locations with precision that suggested operational codes rather than random selection. Silvercat feeds occupied the east corridor's far end. The carousel spun in the central courtyard. Each location became potential piece of larger puzzle. Steve and Dustin staked out these points during mall hours, watched for unusual activity among the ordinary commerce and entertainment. The loading dock behind the mall served legitimate deliveries throughout the day, trucks arriving with merchandise for various stores, workers unloading shipments with practiced efficiency. But one delivery pattern differed from the others. Guards checked credentials more carefully for certain trucks. Containers marked with specific symbols bypassed normal receiving areas. And a service elevator, supposedly under maintenance, operated on irregular schedule that had nothing to do with mall operations. Erica Sinclair, Lucas's younger sister, became essential to the investigation through combination of small size and mercenary attitude toward compensation. The air duct leading from the mall's public areas into restricted service corridors could accommodate a child, but not teenagers or adults. Erica negotiated her participation with demands for free ice cream in perpetuity. Her business acumen impressive for someone barely 10 years old. She crawled through the ductwork while Steve, Robin, and Dustin monitored from outside, her running commentary delivered via walkie-talkie with sass that made Dustin regret involving family. The elevator descended far below the mall's basement level, dropping for what felt like impossible distance into the earth. When it finally stopped and the doors opened, the space beyond resembled nothing connected to American retail. Soviet soldiers patrolled corridors decorated with Cyrillic signage. Scientists in lab coats hurried between rooms filled with equipment that hummed with dangerous energy. The facility extended in multiple directions. A base built beneath Hawkins, with resources suggesting state-level investment in whatever research justified this presence. Discovery of the laser device confirmed the worst suspicions. The machine occupied a chamber the size of an aircraft hangar, its beam focused on empty air that rippled and distorted under the assault. The Russians were attempting to tear open their own gate to the Upside Down, using technology reverse-engineered from American research and powered by energy sources that made the surrounding machinery glow with barely controlled reactions. The beam hadn't penetrated yet, but the dimensional barrier showed stress, weak points developing under sustained bombardment. Escape became complicated when the elevator's controls required keys the group didn't possess. They were trapped underground in a Soviet military facility, surrounded by armed guards with no clear route back to the surface. Steve's attempt at stealing keys resulted in capture, guards dragging him and Robin to interrogation rooms, while Dustin and Erica hid among the equipment. The separation forced different survival strategies, the adults facing direct confrontation, while the children sought alternative solutions. The interrogation involved drugs designed to lower inhibitions and encourage truthfulness, chemicals administered through injection, while Soviet officers demanded explanations for American teenagers infiltrating classified facilities. Steve and Robin, their filters dissolved by pharmaceutical intervention, answered questions with rambling honesty that revealed everything except useful intelligence. They discussed Steve's failed college applications, Robin's unrequited crushes, their evolving friendship, topics utterly irrelevant to strategic concerns but impossible to suppress under the drug's influence. Robin's confession emerged during chemically induced candor, her admission that she'd watched Steve in high school not with attraction but with envy. She'd been obsessed with the girl Steve dated, had wanted that girl's attention for herself, had resented Steve for his effortless ability to date people Robin could only admire from distance. The revelation of her sexuality came without drama or shame, simple truth stated because the drugs prevented anything but honesty. Steve's response, equally unfiltered, was acceptance without qualification or surprise. Dustin and Erica's rescue arrived through combination of determination and chaos. They freed Steve and Robin from the interrogation room, the adults still high and giggling despite their circumstances. The escape through Soviet corridors involved stolen uniforms, bluffing past guards, and eventually running desperately toward any exit they could find. Dr. Alexei Smirnov, a Russian scientist with doubts about his government's dimensional research, chose defection in the moment, fled with the Americans because he recognized catastrophe approaching. Alexei's translation of the facility's purpose confirmed that the Russians intended to access the Upside Down for weapons research, believed the dimension offered strategic advantages in Cold War competition. He explained the laser's function, the gradual weakening of dimensional barriers under sustained assault, the inevitable breakthrough if the machine continued operating. The Gate 11 had closed would be irrelevant once the Russians opened their own. The Mind Flayer would have access regardless of Hawkins Laboratories' sealed breach. July 4th arrived with planned celebrations and unplanned convergence of threats. Starcourt Mall hosted a carnival atmosphere, fireworks scheduled for evening, families gathering for entertainment, and patriotic displays that felt particularly American in a town harboring Soviet operations beneath its newest commercial venture. The mall's parking lots filled with cars. Children ran through corridors clutching balloons and cotton candy. Nobody noticed the armed personnel moving through service areas, the scientists making final preparations, the dimensional barrier reaching critical weakness under sustained laser assault. Eleven's confrontation with Billy and the Mind Flayer occurred in the mall's upper level, where the possessed lifeguard had cornered her and her friends. She used her abilities to throw him across spaces, to crush him against walls, to inflict damage that should have incapacitated anyone fully human. But Billy rose each time, the mind flayer driving his body beyond normal limitations, ignoring pain and injury that would have stopped him. Their battle demolished a storefront, shattered glass raining across tile floors, alarms shrieking unheeded. The mind flayer struck back through Billy, a tentacle emerging from his mouth like obscene tongue, whipping toward 11 with speed she couldn't dodge. The appendage pierced her leg, burrowed into flesh, injected something that felt like acid and ice simultaneously. 11 screamed, fell, clutched at the wound as the tentacle withdrew. Her powers flickered, tried to function, failed completely. The connection to her abilities that had always been present since childhood simply vanished, severed by whatever the mind flayer had introduced to her system. Mike and the others dragged 11 away, while Billy remained motionless, the mind flayer apparently satisfied with disabling its primary threat. They fled to a grocery store within the mall, barricaded themselves in a back room, examined 11's wound with horror and helplessness. The injury showed black veins spreading from the entry point, corruption radiating through her leg. Something moved beneath the skin, a piece of the mind flayer lodged inside her, alive and burrowing deeper. The extraction was brutal and necessary. Jonathan heated a knife until the metal glowed, sterilized by temperature rather than antiseptic. 11 bit down on a wooden spoon, nodded permission despite her terror. He cut into her leg, peeled back skin to reveal the tentacle fragment, writhing like independent organism. 11 used the last vestiges of her abilities to pull the thing free telekinetically, screamed as it tore from her flesh, watched it skitter across the floor before Mike smashed it with a weight. Hopper, Joyce, and Murray Bauman infiltrated the Russian facility through combination of Murray's Russian language skills and Hopper's capacity for violence. They moved through corridors disguised in stolen uniforms, Murray translating signs and intercepted communications, guiding them toward the control room where the laser's operations could be disrupted. Guards fell to Hopper's fists and appropriated weapons. Scientists scattered before the armed intruders. The facility descended into alarm-triggered chaos. The laser's penetration of the dimensional barrier occurred as Hopper reached the controls, the beam finally tearing through weakened reality to create new gate. The rupture appeared as vertical wound identical to the one at Hawkins' laboratory. Darkness beyond light, cold beyond temperature, the upside down, accessible once more. The mind flayer's roar of triumph echoed across dimensions, celebration of regained access to the world it intended to consume. The creature's manifestation demonstrated why it had been assembling biomass throughout summer. The flayed dozens of possessed humans converged on brimborn steelworks and dissolved willingly into the organic mass. Their bodies melted, merged, reformed into something massive and terrible. The mind flayer took physical shape, using stolen flesh, creating a body that towered 3 stories tall, a nightmare of limbs and teeth and mindless hunger given form through horrific sacrifice. The creature attacked Starcourt Mall with single-minded purpose, crashed through walls, pursued 11 and her friends through corridors now evacuated by panicked crowds. It moved with speed that defied its size, tentacles lashing toward the children as they fled. The mall became battleground, stores demolished, infrastructure collapsing. The celebration transformed into disaster movie scenario that felt impossible, even as it occurred. Billy's resistance surfaced in the creature's moment of triumph. 11, powerless and injured, faced the mind flayer directly, accepted death with defiance if not peace. The creature paused, perhaps savouring victory, perhaps gathering strength for final strike. And in that pause, Billy's consciousness fought through the possession, memories of his mother, and better times overwhelming the mind flayer's control momentarily. Max's pleading reached her stepbrother through the entity's grip. She reminded him of beach days and maternal love, of humanity before abuse twisted him. Billy's face showed the war between his will and the mind flayer's control, tears streaming as he positioned himself between 11 and the creature he'd helped build. The tentacles that should have killed her impaled him instead, drove through his body repeatedly as he held position, refused to move, sacrificed himself to save someone he barely knew, because in that moment he chose redemption. Joyce's hand hovered over the keys that would overload the Russian machine, destroy the gate, sever the mind flayer's connection to this dimension. Hopper stood beside her in the control room, surrounded by unconscious guards, aware that detonating the laser would kill anyone still in the facility. They shared a look that communicated everything, years of history and might-have-beens compressed into seconds. She turned the keys simultaneously. The machine screamed, energy discharged in blinding cascade. The explosion consumed the underground facility completely. The mind flayer's physical form collapsed as the gate closed, its connection to the Upside Down severed mid-manifestation. The massive creature dissolved into lifeless biomass, flesh that had been people reduced to organic matter spreading across the mall's ruined interior. Billy died in Max's arms, his final words apologizing for everything, for his cruelty and violence, asking for forgiveness he didn't live long enough to hear granted. Hopper vanished in the explosion's white light, Joyce emerging from the facility alone, her face showing grief too profound for immediate expression. The man who'd protected Hawkins, who'd adopted 11, who'd loved Joyce but never quite said it directly, was gone. The gate was closed, the mind flayer was defeated, and the victory tasted like ash. 3 months passed before the buyer's family prepared to leave Hawkins. September brought fall weather and the practical necessities of moving. Boxes stacked in rooms that had witnessed too much tragedy. Joyce needed distance from memories that haunted every street corner, every familiar location reminding her of Bob's death and Hopper's sacrifice. Will and Jonathan understood without needing explanation. 11, now living with the family through arrangements Dr. Owens facilitated, packed belongings she'd barely accumulated. Hopper's cabin stood empty, his belongings untouched since the July 4th explosion. 11 visited one final time before leaving, read the letter he'd written for her, words about change and growing up that felt prophetic given his absence. The letter acknowledged his failures as father figure, apologized for overprotection, expressed pride in who she was becoming. She folded it carefully, placed it in her small collection of precious things, carried his words with her toward uncertain future. The town mourned Hopper with memorial service and official honors. The police chief who'd died protecting Hawkins from threats the public would never fully understand. His sacrifice joined the other losses that summer, Billy Hargrove remembered with complicated grief, the 31 others who died in the mall fire, according to official reports. The cover story mentioned gas leaks and structural failure, explanations that satisfied most people's need for rational tragedy. 11's powers remained absent months after the mind flayer's tentacle had pierced her leg. She tried daily to move objects, to access abilities that had defined her identity since childhood, found only silence where connection used to exist. The loss felt like amputation, phantom sensations of power that no longer answered her call. She wondered if the abilities would return, or if she'd sacrificed them permanently in the battle. Nobody could answer with certainty. The moving truck filled with furniture and boxes, the buyer's family's life, compressed into labelled containers. Mike stood in the driveway as loading proceeded, dreading the goodbye he'd been postponing mentally. 11 emerged from the house, met his eyes, and they both understood this separation might be permanent. Geographic distance in 1985 meant phone calls and letters, connection requiring effort that relationships didn't always survive. Their embrace lasted longer than either intended, desperation and grief mixing with the love they'd discovered at 12 years old. Mike promised to visit. 11 promised to call, both meant it. Both new circumstances made promises difficult to keep. When they finally separated, tears streaming, the goodbye felt final despite their hopes otherwise. Will waved to his friends from the station wagon's back seat, Lucas and Dustin and Mike watching the buyer's family depart Hawkins for California's distance and supposed safety. The car disappeared down the street, tail lights fading, leaving emptiness that summer's chaos hadn't prepared them for. Hawkins settled into uneasy peace, Starcourt's ruins cordoned off, the town healing from visible wounds while ignoring invisible scars. In Kamchatka, Russia, in a frozen prison compound half a world away, guards selected prisoners for feeding the creature they kept caged. Not the American, one said, pulling a different prisoner toward the door where a demogorgon waited. The American remained in his cell, alive but captive, his fate unknown to everyone who mourned him. 9 months would pass before the next crisis emerged, deadlier and more personal than anything Hawkins had faced. Spring 1986 found the former defenders of Hawkins scattered across the country, their unity fractured by geography and the inevitable drift of adolescence. In Lenora Hills, California, 11 attempted to navigate high school without powers or the friends who'd understood her uniqueness. In Hawkins, those who remained confronted new threats, while grieving absences that left their group incomplete. California offered the Byers family fresh start that proved more difficult than anticipated. Lenora Hills' sunny sprawl contrasted sharply with Hawkins' intimate familiarity. Will attended high school where nobody knew about the Upside Down or his time possessed by ancient evil. He painted obsessively, created art that expressed trauma he couldn't verbalize. His growing awareness of his sexuality complicated adjustment further. Feelings for Mike he recognized but couldn't acknowledge, identity forming in isolation from support systems. Eleven's integration into normal teenage life failed spectacularly despite her best efforts. She enrolled as Jane Hopper, tried to blend into crowds of students who'd never fought monsters or lost friends to dimensional horrors. The other students sensed her difference immediately, targeted her for bullying that ranged from casual exclusion to calculated cruelty. A girl named Angela led campaigns of harassment that made Eleven's days miserable, mocking her clothes and speech patterns and fundamental awkwardness. The bullying reached climax at Rinkomania during a school trip. Angela orchestrated public humiliation, presented a slideshow of photographs mocking Eleven's outfit and social failures, laughed as Eleven's careful construction of normalcy collapsed. The rage that built within Eleven found no outlet through abilities that remained dormant. She grabbed a roller skate instead, struck Angela across the face, broke the girl's nose, and her own chances at normal high school experience simultaneously. Jonathan Byers pursued college at community level, his photography talents noted, but his ambitions uncertain. His new friend Argyle worked at Surfer Boy Pizza, brought California stoner philosophy to their friendship, provided transportation and marijuana in equal measure. Jonathan's relationship with Nancy suffered under long-distance strain, phone calls becoming less frequent, connection fading despite promises to maintain it. Mike Wheeler's visit to California for spring break represented desperate attempt to restore what distance had eroded. He arrived expecting reunion to feel natural, found instead awkwardness and change. Eleven had been lying in her letters about her life's success. Will watched Mike with emotions he couldn't express. The easy friendship they'd shared felt strained by time, and unspoken tensions neither boy could name. In Hawkins, the community continued its recovery from Starcourt Mall's destruction. Downtown businesses rebounded slightly without the mall's competition. New families moved in, attracted by affordable housing and small-town atmosphere. The high school prepared for basketball championship, Lucas Sinclair among the players drawing attention. Life proceeded with surface normality that masked darker currents. Eddie Munson occupied Hawkins High's margins proudly, a metalhead senior repeating his final year for the third time. He led the Hellfire Club, the school's Dungeons and Dragons group, with theatrical enthusiasm that annoyed jocks and administrators equally. His long hair, battle vest decorated with patches, and association with metal music made him target for suspicion from parents who blamed satanic influences for anything they didn't understand. Max Mayfield withdrew from everyone after Billy's death, her grief manifesting as isolation and self-destructive patterns. She ended her relationship with Lucas, refused comfort from friends, spent hours at Billy's grave, talking to someone who couldn't answer. Her mother's alcoholism worsened. The trailer park where they lived felt increasingly unstable. Max's headaches began that spring, nosebleeds following, symptoms she dismissed as stress rather than recognizing them as warning. Chrissy Cunningham represented everything Hawkins High valued in students. Cheerleader, popular, dating the basketball team captain Jason Carver, she embodied success and normalcy. Nobody knew about her eating disorder, her mother's psychological abuse, her desperate attempts to control something in life that felt increasingly uncontrollable. When headaches and nightmares began plaguing her, when a grandfather clock appeared in her visions, she sought help from Eddie Munson, hoping he could provide drugs to make the symptoms stop. The meeting at Eddie's trailer occurred late on March 21st, 1986. Chrissy followed Eddie inside, accepted his offer of something stronger than marijuana, waited while he searched for the product in his bedroom. The vision took her while Eddie was absent, the grandfather clock chiming, reality shifting into nightmare. She levitated suddenly, her bones breaking with sounds like gunfire, her eyes collapsing inward. Eddie emerged from his room to find her suspended in air, dying in ways that defied physics and sanity. She crashed to the floor, dead, her body twisted impossibly. Eddie fled in panic, his instinct for self-preservation overriding everything else. He knew how this looked, knew his reputation made him perfect suspect, knew nobody would believe dimensional horror killed a cheerleader in his trailer. He went into hiding at Reefer Rick's lake house, a dealer currently imprisoned, abandoned property where Eddie could disappear while trying to process what he'd witnessed. Vecna had begun his killing spree with calculated purpose. Henry Creel, transformed and powerful in the Upside Down, had spent years building strength, studying Hawkins through the dimensional barriers, selecting victims with trauma and secrets he could exploit. 4 kills would create enough psychic energy to tear permanent gates across Hawkins, would merge dimensions and allow invasion beyond anything previously attempted. Chrissy was first, 3 more would follow. The investigation treated Chrissy's death as satanic ritual murder, the panic of the 1980s finding perfect scapegoat in Eddie Munson. Jason Carver, grief-stricken and seeking someone to blame, led vigilante efforts to find Eddie. The police chief, lacking Hopper's instinct and experience, accepted the obvious explanation. And in California, oblivious to Hawkins' newest crisis, 11 prepared to face consequences for attacking Angela, while her friends faced a predator none of them understood yet. The package arrived at Joyce's house in Lenora Hills without return address, covered in Russian stamps and customs declarations that raised more questions than they answered. Inside the box sat a porcelain doll, garish and unsettling, the kind of tourist trinket sold at Moscow markets. Joyce called Murray Bauman immediately, her paranoia about Russian involvement in Hawkins making her suspect the doll represented threat rather than gift. Murray walked her through, dismantling it carefully, checking for explosives or surveillance devices, finding instead a note hidden within the hollow body. The message came from someone calling himself Enzo, a guard at Kamchatka prison who claimed to have information Joyce would want desperately. Hopper was alive. The explosion that should have killed him had instead knocked him into lower levels of the Russian facility, where soldiers captured him before American forces secured the scene. He'd been transported to Russia, imprisoned in a facility that tested upside-down creatures on political prisoners and criminals. Enzo offered to facilitate Hopper's escape for $40,000, money that would allow him to flee Russia with his family. Joyce's belief in the note came from hope, rather than evidence initially. She wanted Hopper alive so intensely that any possibility, however remote, demanded pursuit. But Murray's investigation confirmed details only someone with access to Soviet intelligence would know. The Kamchatka facility existed. Hopper's disappearance from the explosion site had never been fully explained, and the dollar amount suggested desperation rather than elaborate scam, a guard risking everything for escape money. The journey to Russia required careful planning and substantial risk. Joyce sold her house to raise the necessary funds, liquidated everything for cash that could be transported without electronic trails. Murray arranged contacts in Alaska, smugglers who operated across the Bering Strait carrying people and contraband between continents. Yuri Ismailov, a pilot who'd flown questionable cargo for decades, agreed to transport them for a fee that nearly exhausted Joyce's resources before the actual rescue began. Yuri's loyalties proved flexible and profit-driven. He accepted Joyce and Murray's money, flew them toward the rendezvous point with Enzo, then diverted to Soviet-controlled territory, intending to sell them for reward money that exceeded their payment. His betrayal demonstrated the complications of trusting criminals with moral missions. Joyce and Murray found themselves imprisoned briefly, forced to convince Yuri that helping them offered better returns than turning them over to authorities who might not pay as promised. Hopper's survival in Kamchatka demonstrated resilience forged through years of police work, military service, and fighting interdimensional threats. The prison camp subjected inmates to forced labor in brutal conditions, building railroads through frozen wilderness, enduring cold that killed weaker prisoners regularly. Hopper formed alliance with Dmitry Enzo Antonov, the guard who'd contacted Joyce, their relationship built on mutual need and cautious respect. The Demogorgon fights occurred in the prison's arena, where guards entertained themselves by forcing inmates to battle the creature they'd obtained through Soviet dimensional research. Most prisoners died quickly, torn apart by the apex predator. Hopper survived through strategy and improvisation, used a spear and makeshift flamethrower to exploit the creature's weakness to fire. His victories earned grudging respect from guards and fellow prisoners, bought him time to plan escape with Enzo's assistance. The rescue converged 3 separate operations towards single goal. Joyce and Murray, having convinced Yuri to actually help them, flew into Soviet airspace at extreme risk. Hopper and Enzo prepared their prison break, timing it to coincide with chaos Joyce's arrival would create. And in the arena, Hopper faced the Demogorgon one final time, this battle providing distraction while other elements of the escape proceeded. Parallel to these events, 11 faced different form of imprisonment and potential liberation. Dr. Sam Owens contacted her in California, explained that her powers might be restored through experimental program he'd developed. The Nina project, conducted in a secret facility in Nevada desert, would use immersive memory therapy to rebuild the neural pathways trauma and the Mind Flayer's attack had severed. 11's abilities weren't gone permanently, but suppressed, locked behind psychological barriers that reliving key memories might dissolve. The decision to enter Nina meant trusting Owens and the government institutions that had previously used her. It meant leaving California and the fragile normal life she'd attempted to build. Most concerning, it meant working with Dr. Martin Brenner, who Owens revealed had survived the Demogorgon attack in Season 1, had been recovering while continuing his research into psychic phenomena and dimensional physics. Brenner's reappearance brought complicated emotions. 11 struggled to process. He'd raised her, abused her, shaped everything about her existence before her escape. Papa was monster and father figure simultaneously, her hatred and desperate need for his approval existing in uncomfortable tension. He greeted her warmly, expressed pride in her choices and growth, spoke as if their separation had been unfortunate circumstance rather than her fleeing his control. The Nina facility resembled a summer camp on surface, cabins and recreational areas designed to appear harmless. Beneath this facade lay sophisticated technology for inducing controlled hallucinations, creating immersive environments where 11 could relive memories with sensory detail approaching actual experience. She entered the program willingly, despite misgivings, desperate to regain abilities that defined her identity and usefulness to friends facing danger without her. The memories Nina accessed began with pleasant experiences, early childhood moments before Hawkins Lab's darker aspects dominated. But the program's true purpose required confronting September 8th, 1979, the day 11 had suppressed completely, the massacre in the Rainbow Room she'd witnessed but couldn't consciously remember. The memories emerged gradually, carefully managed by Brenner to avoid overwhelming her, revealing truth about that day's events piece by disturbing piece. Henry Creel's face appeared in these memories, though she'd known him as Peter Ballard, the kind orderly who'd befriended her when other staff maintained clinical distance. He'd seemed Ally, someone who understood her loneliness, who treated her as person rather than experiment. The memories showed their growing connection, his encouragement of her abilities, his subtle manipulation towards specific goals she'd been too young and isolated to recognize. The revelation built toward inevitable horror. Henry wasn't fellow victim but original cause. He'd been Brenner's first subject, test subject 1, his abilities far exceeding what 11 would later demonstrate. He'd convinced her to remove the device suppressing his powers, had slaughtered nearly everyone in the facility, had offered her partnership in destroying the world beyond the lab. And 11, 8 years old and terrified, had fought him with everything she possessed, had banished him to the upside down through power she didn't know she had. While 11 confronted her past in Nevada, while Joyce fought to reach Hopper in Russia, Hawkins descended further into Vecna's killing pattern. The investigations, the rescues, the memories, all proceeded toward convergence that would reveal how deeply everything was connected. Victor Creel's confession played on loop in Nancy's mind as she researched the family murders that had occurred decades before her birth. The elderly man, imprisoned in psychiatric facility since 1959, claimed a demon had killed his wife, Virginia, and daughter Alice in their Hawkins home. Authorities dismissed his testimony as delusion designed to avoid murder conviction. Nancy suspected truth lay somewhere between supernatural claim and official skepticism. Her experience with the Upside Down, having taught her that impossible explanations sometimes proved accurate. The Creel house stood abandoned since the murders, its Victorian architecture decaying slowly on the edge of town. Neighbours avoided it. Children dared each other to approach the property, but rarely crossed the threshold. Nancy, Steve, Robin, and Eddie entered through a side door, found interior frozen in 1959, with furniture covered in dust and decay. Grandfather clocks appeared throughout the house, Victorian timepieces that matched the vision Vecna's victims reported before their deaths. The connection between 1959 murders and 1986 killings became undeniable. Henry Creel had been a child when his family moved into that house, a boy who already demonstrated abilities that frightened and fascinated him. He could move objects with his mind, could sense thoughts and emotions from those around him, could reach into animals' minds and control their actions. His parents noticed the dead or injured creatures appearing near their home, the disturbing drawings Henry produced, the way lights flickered when he experienced strong emotions. They attributed these signs to adolescent trouble rather than supernatural capability. Virginia Creel tried to help her son through normal means, therapy, and discipline and maternal concern. Alice, Henry's younger sister, sensed something wrong with her brother but lacked framework to articulate her fears. Victor worked long hours, avoided home situations that confused him, retreated into work rather than confronting family problems directly. The household maintained facade of normalcy, while Henry's powers and psychological disturbances grew stronger. The murders occurred after Henry decided his family represented obstacles to his potential. He'd concluded that humanity's conventional morality restricted those with abilities beyond normal limitations, that someone with his powers shouldn't be constrained by ordinary rules designed for ordinary people. His mother and sister died through psychic attack, their bones broken, their eyes destroyed, killed in exactly the manner Vecna would later employ against victims in 1986. Victor survived because Henry wanted a witness, someone who'd be blamed, someone whose sanity would be destroyed by grief and incomprehension. Dr. Martin Brenner recognized what Henry represented when the boy entered the psychiatric system following his father's conviction. A child with genuine psychic abilities, powers that exceeded anything Brenner's research had achieved through adult subjects. Brenner arranged Henry's transfer from psychiatric care to Hawkins' laboratory, created false records showing the boy's death, began working with Subject 1 as he would later be designated. This was 1959, years before the MKUltra program would produce 11, decades before dimensional barriers would be breached. Henry's time at the laboratory passed through stages of cooperation and resistance. He accepted testing initially, allowed Brenner to study his abilities, participated in experiments designed to measure and enhance his powers. But Henry's fundamental nature resisted control. He believed himself superior to those studying him, resented Brenner's authority, plotted eventually to escape and use his abilities without restriction. Brenner recognized these tendencies, implanted a device in Henry's neck that suppressed his powers, reduced him to manageable levels while research continued. The suppression lasted years, Henry aging from child to young adult within laboratory confines. Brenner added other subjects to the program. As techniques improved, children taken or manipulated into testing numbered sequentially as they entered. Henry watched Brenner create the environment he'd experienced, saw children subjected to isolation and control, observed from position of both victim and conspirator. He became Peter Ballard to the staff, worked as orderly, helped manage the younger subjects while hiding his true identity as test subject 1. September 8th, 1979, marked the culmination of Henry's long manipulation toward freedom. He'd befriended 11, the youngest subject, but potentially most powerful, earned her trust through kindness that contrasted sharply with Brenner's clinical approach. He convinced her that Brenner was the true monster, that the laboratory imprisoned them both, that she could free them by removing his suppressor. 11, 8 years old, and desperate for ally in her isolation, trusted Peter and removed the device. The massacre that followed demonstrated Henry's true capabilities once freed from suppression. He killed orderlies and scientists systematically, his powers crushing them without physical contact. The other test subjects died next, children who'd lived alongside 11 eliminated because Henry saw them as Brenner's creations rather than fellow victims deserving rescue. Blood covered the rainbow room where they'd trained, bodies piled in corridors, the laboratory transformed into charnel house within minutes. 11 confronted Henry in the rainbow room surrounded by death he'd created. He offered her partnership, promised they could reshape the world together, argued that their powers made them beyond conventional morality. She refused, recognized in his words the philosophy that led to murdered families and slaughtered children. Their battle exceeded anything the laboratory had measured in testing, psychic forces colliding with intensity that damaged the facility's structure. 11, desperate and terrified, reached deeper into her abilities than Brenner's training had accessed, found reserves of power she didn't know existed. She didn't kill Henry. The concept probably didn't occur to her 8-year-old mind. Instead, she pushed him away, rejected him with force that tore through dimensional barriers. A gate opened in the laboratory wall, vertical wound in reality, and Henry fell through into the darkness beyond. The gate closed behind him, trapping him in the dimension that would become the Upside Down. 11 collapsed, her mind shutting down to protect itself from trauma, suppressing the memory completely. Henry's transformation in the Upside Down occurred gradually. The dimension's environment altered him, lightning scarring his body, the alien atmosphere mutating his biology. He became something between human and the dimension itself, merged with the Upside Down's nature, controlled it and was controlled by it simultaneously. The Mind Flayer, the massive shadow creature Will had witnessed, was Henry's creation or extension, power made manifest through the dimension's substance. Everything that had emerged from the Upside Down, demogorgons and demodogs, and the organic networks, ultimately served Vecna's will. The Upside Down froze at November 6, 1983, because that was when 11 next opened a gate, her psychic contact with the demogorgon, creating the breach Henry had been manipulating her toward. The dimension captured Hawkins at that moment, preserved it like insect in amber, created the dark mirror that had haunted the town since. Henry had been orchestrating invasions from the beginning, using creatures and possession and gradual corruption to prepare for his ultimate return. Max Mayfield's symptoms aligned perfectly with Vecna's previous victims once patterns were recognized. The headaches she'd dismissed as stress, The nosebleeds she'd attributed to dry California air during brief visits. The nightmares about Billy's death that felt increasingly vivid, all matched what Fred Benson and Patrick McKinney had experienced. Before their deaths, she'd been cursed for weeks, Vecna's influence building gradually, her trauma and guilt over Billy making her ideal target for a predator who fed on psychological suffering. The discovery that music could interrupt Vecna's connection came through desperate theorizing rather than systematic research. Robin noticed that victims reported being pulled from reality into trance states, their consciousness transported to Vecna's mindscape, while their bodies remained vulnerable. Nancy hypothesized that strong emotional anchors might disrupt this psychic displacement, might pull victims back to reality before the curse completed. Music, with its direct connection to memory and emotion, offered potential lifeline if the right song could reach through Vecna's influence. Max's favorite song was Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, a track from 1985 that she'd played constantly during her relationship with Lucas, that had provided soundtrack to better times before Billy's death complicated everything. The cassette stayed in her Walkman, the tape worn from repeated listening, the lyrics about making deals with God and swapping places carrying particular resonance for someone drowning in survivor's guilt. Her friends gathered the tape, the headphones, prepared to test their theory if Vecna struck again. The attack came while Max sat in the guidance counselor's office at Hawkins High, reliving Billy's sacrifice through session designed to process grief. She blinked and found herself transported to the Creel house, not the abandoned building in Hawkins, but a version existing in nightmare space, Vecna's mindscape, where he brought victims before killing them. The grandfather clock chimed, each tone resonating through her bones. Vecna appeared, massive and terrible, his voice combining Henry Creel's human tones with something far older and more malevolent. He showed her visions of her guilt, Billy dying while she watched helpless, her mother's alcoholism that Max blamed partly on herself, the letters she'd written to friends confessing thoughts she'd never spoken aloud. Vecna fed on her suffering, amplified it, used her psychological pain as gateway for the curse's final stage. Max tried to run through the mindscape's twisted corridors, found herself always circling back to the same location, to Vecna, waiting with patient certainty. In the real world, Max's body levitated in the guidance counselor's office, lifted by Vecna's power as previous victims had been. Her friends, monitoring her through windows, recognized the signs immediately. Lucas grabbed her Walkman, fumbled with the tape, pressed play with desperate urgency. The music began. Kate Bush's voice, singing about running up that hill, about making deals, about understanding. The song penetrated Vecna's mindscape faintly at first, distant and distorted, like music heard underwater. Max heard it beneath Vecna's monologue about her worthlessness, his promises of release from guilt through death. The melody triggered memories of better times, of Lucas and friendship, and moments before grief consumed everything. She ran toward the sound, fled Vecna's presence through corridors that shifted and changed, pursued by the entity whose certainty in her death had been absolute. The chase through Mindscape merged with memories, Max running through Hawkins, as she remembered it, through the mall before its destruction, through the arcade where she'd earned the Mad Max high score, through every location that meant home and safety. Vecna pursued, his form expanding to fill space behind her, tentacles reaching for her fleeing form. The music grew louder, Kate Bush's voice clearer, the emotional connection to reality strengthening. The graveyard appeared ahead, the physical location where her friends waited, their shouting barely audible beneath the music's driving beat. Max ran toward them, toward Lucas holding the Walkman, toward life she'd nearly surrendered to guilt and manipulation. Vecna's grasp closed around her ankle, began pulling her back toward death. She kicked free, made final desperate sprint, broke through the barrier between mindscape and reality. Max crashed back into her body gasping, fell from her levitation, caught by Lucas before she hit the ground. Her eyes focused on faces surrounding her, friends who'd saved her through simple recognition of what she needed. The Walkman continued playing, The song's final verses about swapping places and making deals resonating differently now that she'd nearly made the ultimate trade. She'd escaped Vecna's curse at the final possible moment, survived through music and friendship, and refusing to surrender despite everything. The victory was temporary. Everyone understood immediately. Max had been Vecna's intended fourth victim. The final kill needed to tear permanent gates across Hawkins. He'd been denied this time, but his curse marked her still. The symptoms would return. He would try again. And next time, they might not reach her in time with the right song and the right memories to pull her back. The discovery that music disrupted Vecna's power provided both hope and limited solution. Each victim needed their own anchor, their own emotional connection strong enough to penetrate psychic manipulation. The strategy wasn't universally applicable, couldn't protect everyone, but it gave potential victims fighting chance rather than helpless acceptance of predetermined death. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan's military operation against the Nina facility came from misguided protective instinct rather than malicious intent. He believed 11 represented existential threat to national security, that her abilities and the dimensional breaches connected to her made her too dangerous to exist outside government control or elimination. His assault on the Nevada installation brought armed soldiers against scientists and a girl whose powers were only partially restored, whose training remained incomplete. Dr. Brenner's final act was protecting the subject he'd controlled and arguably loved in his own damaged way. He positioned himself between 11 and the soldiers, used his authority and presence to delay their advance, gave her crucial seconds to escape with Dr. Owens. The soldiers shot him, multiple rounds ending the man who'd shaped 11's entire existence. He died reaching towards her, his last word, goodbye, carrying weight of everything left unsaid between them. 11 fled with Owens, her feelings about Brenner's death too complicated for immediate processing. The California group's journey to Nevada came through Mike's desperation to reach 11 and help however possible. Jonathan, Will, Mike, and Argyle piled into the Surfer Boy pizza van, a vehicle absurdly bright and commercial for a rescue mission, but the only transportation available. Argyle's participation came from friendship and his somewhat addled but genuine desire to help, his perpetual positivity providing unexpected emotional support during crisis. They found 11 and Owens at a Surfer Boy pizza location, the franchise coincidence feeling almost cosmically convenient. 11 emerged from hiding, reunited with Mike after months of separation and recent trauma, their embrace communicating everything words couldn't adequately express. Her powers had returned through Nina's memory work, though not to full strength yet, abilities rebuilding gradually as her mind reintegrated suppressed experiences. The salt bath constructed in the pizza parlor's freezer demonstrated both desperation and ingenuity. 11 needed sensory deprivation to use her abilities at distance, to fight Vecna psychically while her friends confronted him physically in Hawkins. The freezer's insulation provided darkness. Pounds of salt in cold water created flotation. She sank into improvised tank wearing swimming goggles, surrounded by her California friends, her consciousness extending across states toward the battle preparing in Indiana. In Russia, Hopper and Enzo's escape from Kamchatka involved violence and calculated risk in equal measure. They fought their way through guards, killed demogorgons with weapons scavenged from the prison's arsenal, commandeered vehicles for the journey to where Joyce and Murray waited with Yuri's plane. The reunion between Joyce and Hopper, months after she'd believed him dead, carried weight of grief and relief, and love finally acknowledged without hesitation. The flight back to the United States crossed international boundaries without proper authorization, Yuri's piloting skills and Murray's contacts enabling the journey that should have been impossible. They flew toward Hawkins, understanding they'd arrived too late to prevent the battle's beginning, but hoping to contribute before its end. The demogorgons they'd killed in escaping the prison proved that fire remained effective against creatures from the upside down, knowledge that would inform final strategies. In Hawkins, those who remained prepared for confrontation, they understood only partially. Nancy, Steve, Robin, Dustin, Lucas, Erica, Max and Eddie gathered weapons and supplies, created plan from incomplete information and desperate determination. They knew Vecna operated from the Creel house in the Upside Down. They knew he needed Max's death to complete his curse. They knew 11 would fight him psychically from distance. The strategy emerged from these facts: 3 simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm Vecna's ability to defend multiple fronts. Eddie volunteered to create distraction in the Upside Down, drawing the Demobat swarms away from the Creel house using his guitar and amplified music. Steve, Nancy, and Robin would attack Vecna physically, while he fought 11 mentally. Dustin would support Eddie. Lucas and Erica would guard Max's body during her use as bait, the strategy requiring her to enter Vecna's mindscape voluntarily, drawing his attention while others struck. The plan was risky, bordering on suicidal, but alternatives offered no better odds of success. The weapons they prepared ranged from Molotov cocktails to sawed-off shotguns to nail-studded shields, improvised arsenal reflecting teenage resourcefulness applied to interdimensional warfare. They modified their approach through lessons learned in previous battles, understood that heat and physical damage combined offered best chance against enemies that defied normal biology. Nancy's determination to end Vecna personally drove her weapon selection toward maximum destructive potential. The war room planning session in the Wheeler basement felt simultaneously absurd and necessary. Teenagers strategizing against ancient evil in the same space where they'd played Dungeons and Dragons years earlier. The game had prepared them better than traditional education for battles requiring imagination and tactical thinking. They'd spent years fighting fictional monsters. Now they applied those skills towards surviving real ones. The final battle unfolded across multiple dimensions on a March evening that would reshape Hawkins forever. 3 teams moved into position, each carrying the weight of impossible responsibility. In the upside-down version of the Wheeler house, Eddie Munson strapped on his guitar while Dustin Henderson prepared their amplifier. Their mission was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Play loud enough to draw every Demobat in the Upside Down away from Vecna's lair. Eddie's fingers found the opening notes of Metallica's Master of Puppets, and the sound tore through the toxic air like lightning. The bats responded immediately, a shrieking cloud of leather wings and teeth converging on the Wheeler house. Eddie and Dustin had perhaps minutes before the swarm broke through their defenses. They played anyway, Eddie's face alive with the joy of one final perfect moment. At the Creel house, Nancy Wheeler, Steve Harrington, and Robin Buckley climbed into the attic, where Vecna hung suspended in his nest of vines. They carried Molotov cocktails and Nancy's shotgun, weapons that seemed laughably inadequate against a being who'd survived dimensional exile. But they struck anyway. Fire bloomed across Vecna's body as Nancy fired round after round into his chest. The monster fell, burning, and for one beautiful moment they believed they'd won. In the real Hawkins, Lucas Sinclair and his sister Erica stood guard over Max's body in the Creel house attic. Max lay in a trance, bait for Vecna, her consciousness serving as the lure, while 11 fought psychically from Nevada. Lucas held her hand and waited, helpless, as Jason Carver and his teammate burst through the door with baseball bats and rage. Jason's girlfriend had died to Vecna, and he blamed Eddie, blamed the entire group, blamed Dungeons and Dragons itself. In his grief-twisted logic, stopping the ritual meant attacking the Guardians. Lucas fought Jason while Erica fled. Max's body jerked as Vecna took hold. Her eyes rolled back, her limbs went rigid, and she began to rise into the air just as Chrissy Cunningham had weeks earlier. Lucas, pinned beneath Jason's rage, could only scream her name. In Nevada, 11 fought with everything she'd reclaimed. She battled Vecna in the psychic realm, while her physical body seized in the pizza parlor's freezer. But Vecna had grown stronger in his months of feeding. He overwhelmed her defenses, turned his full attention to Max, and began the killing sequence he'd perfected across 4 victims. Max's bones snapped one by one. The sounds echoed through the Creel house attic. Her eyes bled, the vessels bursting as Vecna consumed her trauma and pain. Lucas broke free from Jason just in time to catch her as she fell, her body broken, her eyes ruined, her breathing stopped. She died in his arms, technically fulfilling Vecna's requirement for a fourth victim. 11, desperate and grieving, reached across the distance and restarted Max's heart through pure force of will. The psychic equivalent of CPR, brutal and effective. Max's chest heaved with breath again, but her mind remained unreachable, trapped somewhere 11 couldn't follow. The girl who'd escaped Vecna's curse through Kate Bush now existed in twilight between life and death. The fourth kill, even interrupted, proved sufficient. 4 gates ripped through Hawkins, originating from each murder site, converging in an X pattern through downtown. The earth split apart. Buildings collapsed. Fire and ash and the red glow of the upside down spilled through the cracks. 22 people died in the initial quake according to official reports, though the true number would prove higher. Back in the upside down, Eddie Munson made a choice. The bats had breached their defences and Dustin was vulnerable. Eddie cut the rope connecting the dimensions, trapping himself on the wrong side, and led the Demobats away from his friend. They caught him in the street. He died fighting, his body torn by countless bites, his last thoughts of his uncle and the friends who'd believed in him when no one else had. Vecna, wounded but regenerating in his attic, had won. Hawkins split apart as the Upside Down began its final invasion. 2 days passed before the full scope of catastrophe became clear. Hawkins existed under martial law, the National Guard establishing perimeters around the expanding rifts. The downtown area lay in ruins, buildings collapsed or bisected by the 4 gates that glowed with sickly red light. Dust fell like snow across the town, though it wasn't dust at all, but spores from the Upside Down, particles of another dimension settling over playgrounds and churches. The Hawkins High Gymnasium became a refugee centre. Families who'd lost homes to the earthquake gathered under basketball hoops, sleeping on cots provided by FEMA, eating from food banks, searching bulletin boards for missing loved ones. Steve, Nancy, and Robin worked the volunteer stations, distributing blankets and helping elderly residents find their medications. They moved through the chaos in shocked silence, processing Eddie's death and Max's condition. Max lay in Hawkins Memorial Hospital, her body alive through 11's intervention, but her mind unreachable. Lucas sat beside her bed, for hours holding her hand, talking to her about nothing and everything, hoping some part of her remained aware. The doctors used terms like vegetative state and minimal brain activity. Lucas ignored them, and then Hopper walked through the gymnasium doors. Joyce saw him first, dropping the box of supplies she'd been carrying, running across the basketball court into arms she'd thought lost forever. 11 followed moments later, father and daughter reuniting in tears and wordless relief. The others gathered around, questions spilling out about Russian prisons and impossible survival, but those answers could wait. For now, presence mattered more than explanation. That evening, the group gathered at Hopper's cabin on the outskirts of town. Through the windows, they could see the red glow over Hawkins, could feel the wrongness in the air. Will's neck prickled with familiar sensation. Vecna had survived. The Upside Down continued spreading through the rifts like infection through wounded tissue, and somewhere in that crimson darkness, the monster who'd orchestrated everything planned his final move. The battle was over. The war remained. 18 months transformed Hawkins from disaster zone to occupied territory. By fall 1987, the military had established permanent installations throughout the town, checkpoints, and barbed wire perimeters surrounding the rift zones. The official story blamed seismic activity. The soldiers knew better. They'd seen things crawling from those red-lit cracks, had lost personnel to creatures that shouldn't exist. Dr. Kay led the military investigation, a stern woman convinced that answers lay in finding the girl with abilities. 11 remained the target of a manhunt that stretched across state lines. She trained in hiding with Hopper and Joyce, developing her powers in safe houses and abandoned buildings, always moving, never settling. The girl who'd once longed for normal life now existed as a fugitive. In Hawkins, the remaining defenders adapted to their militarized reality. Nancy attended college remotely. Jonathan worked odd jobs. Steve managed a video store that saw decreasing business as families continued fleeing town. They waited for the inevitable next crisis, knowing Vecna's silence meant planning rather than defeat. The crisis arrived through Holly Wheeler. Mike's younger sister, now 11 years old, began experiencing symptoms the group recognized too well. Headaches, nosebleeds, visions of a burned figure with reaching hands. Vecna had expanded his targeting from traumatized teenagers to children specifically, though his purpose remained unclear until Volume 1's 4th episode. Vecna needed 12 children as vessels for his final plan. He would merge Dimension X, the Abyss, the source dimension beyond the Upside Down, with Earth itself. Holly was taken in Episode 2, pulled screaming into Vecna's mindscape, despite every protection the group had erected. Nancy's anguish drove much of Volume 1's emotional weight. Episode 4 brought revelation of a different sort. During a Demogorgon attack at the military base, Will manifested powers he'd hidden for months. Telekinesis like Eleven's, but different in signature and source. His eyes didn't bleed but turned white, mirroring Vecna's influence. The boy who'd been the Upside Down's first victim had become something new through years of connection to that realm. And Carly returned. 8, 11's sister from the Chicago gang, arrived with skills the group desperately needed. Volume 1 ended on uncertainty and questions. How far did Will's powers extend? Could Vecna be defeated if he existed across dimensions? And what would become of Holly Wheeler and the other children trapped in the monster's mind? Volume 2 arrived on Christmas Day 2025 with episodes that recontextualized everything the audience thought they understood about the Upside Down. Episodes 5 through 7, titled Shock Jock, Escape from Camazotz, and The Bridge, revealed the dimension's true nature. Not a parallel world at all, but a wormhole connecting Hawkins to something older and darker. Dimension X, the Abyss. Henry Creel's powers had never originated from human experimentation. He'd been touched by Dimension X as a child, a conduit for forces beyond comprehension. When Eleven banished him in 1979, she hadn't created the Upside Down, but rather opened a stable wormhole to a place that had always existed, waiting. The dimension froze at November 1983 because that was when 11 first opened a gate, pulling Will's memories and Hawkins' geography into the wormhole as template. Max and Holly existed together in Vecna's mindscape, a place the characters called Camazotz after the darkness from A Wrinkle in Time. Their scenes provided emotional anchor as the mythology expanded. Max, still technically comatose in the real world, retained consciousness in this psychic prison. She protected Holly when she could, becoming older sister to Mike's younger sibling. Will came out to his friends and family in episode 6. The scene played simply, honestly. "I don't like girls," he told Mike and the others during a quiet moment at the cabin. The group responded with acceptance and love, a wordless hug conveying what speeches couldn't. His journey from the boy taken by monsters to the young man acknowledging his truth formed one of the series' most complete character arcs. Vecna's plan crystallized. 12 children served as anchors, their innocent minds providing pathways for Dimension X to fully merge with Earth. The Upside Down would expand beyond Hawkins, consuming reality itself. Stopping him required infiltrating the military compound where experiments continued, rescuing the kidnapped children, and confronting Vecna across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Carly agreed to a terrible bargain. Closing the wormhole permanently would require sacrifice from someone with abilities. She volunteered, telling 11 that some debts could only be repaid through final gestures. Volume 2 ended with plans formed and goodbyes said, everyone understanding that not all of them would survive what came next. The finale waited for New Year's Eve. Episode 8 arrived on December 31st, 2025, a 2-hour and 8-minute finale titled The Right Side Up. The name itself promised restoration, a return to normalcy after years of shadow. The battle unfolded across every front simultaneously. 11, Carly and Max invaded Vecna's mindscape to free the children. Hopper and Murray carried explosives into the Upside Down's heart. The others fought through the abyss itself to reach the trapped victims before the dimensions merged. Vecna fell through 11's fury, refined through 5 seasons of growth. She impaled him, driving her power through the monster's body and disabling his anchor to reality. As Vecna struggled in his weakened state, Joyce delivered the final blow, swinging an axe that separated his head from his body and ended his threat forever. All 12 children were rescued alive, pulled from Camazots back into their bodies. The victory came with anticipated cost. Dr. K confronted them at the portal's edge, demanding 11's surrender. Instead, 11 chose sacrifice over capture. She stayed in the collapsing wormhole, using her abilities to seal the rift from within. Her psychic goodbye to Mike echoed their first meeting in the rain. Then she was gone, the Upside Down destroyed, Dimension X severed from Earth. Vecna's threat ended forever. But was 11 truly gone? The epilogue jumped 18 months to spring, 1989. Hawkins had recovered, the rift sealed, the spores cleared, normalcy genuinely restored. The gymnasium held graduation ceremonies. Steve coached Little League Baseball. Robin worked at the local radio station. Joyce and Hopper, engaged now, planned their move to Montauk, a quiet coastal town where they could finally rest. At the graduation party, Mike told a story to his friends, framed as a Dungeons and Dragons tale. In it, the heroic mage didn't die in her sacrifice, but found a way to survive, living peacefully somewhere far from those who would hunt her. Perhaps with her sister, perhaps in a place where no one knew her past. The story ended with hope rather than certainty. The final image showed a young woman walking alone through a remote, beautiful landscape, fields stretching toward mountains, sun warming her face, peace in her expression. Whether this was 11 living the life Mike imagined for her, or merely a dream, or something else entirely, the show left deliberately unanswered. David Bowie's Heroes soundtracked the final credits, its lyrics about being heroes just for one day carrying new weight. The children who defended Hawkins through 5 years of nightmares graduated into futures no longer haunted. The shadow had lifted, the story complete. Our journey through Hawkins comes to rest where all stories do, with the knowledge that courage and friendship can overcome any darkness. We've travelled from November 1983 to spring 1989, watched children become heroes, seen ordinary people face extraordinary evil, and prevail through love and loyalty and stubborn refusal to surrender. The Upside Down is sealed. Vecna defeated. 11 found her place in the world, beyond laboratories and hiding. The friends who played Dungeons and Dragons in Mike Wheeler's basement saved their town, their world, themselves. They graduated. They moved forward. They carried scars but refused to let those scars define them. Hawkins, Indiana returned to the ordinary life it had known before government experiments tore holes in reality. The mall closed, the rifts healed, families rebuilt, and somewhere in all that reconstruction, normalcy became something precious rather than boring, safety something earned rather than assumed. So rest now, dear listener. Let these 5 years of supernatural chaos fade into comfortable memory as sleep approaches. The monsters are gone. The gates are closed. The children are safe. May your sleep be filled with the certainty that, even in deepest darkness, there is always light. Sweet dreams.